Chapter 591. Yesterday, I made a series of mistakes. First, I wrote in a hurry, resulting in too many typos. Then, when I was editing, I changed the content to the vote solicitation chapter. Fortunately, a book friend reminded me on QQ. Only then did I understand. This is a very annoying matter. As for being accused of changing it to be pretentious, it also made me angry for a while. If this was pretentious, then if I made a mistake in the vote solicitation, wouldn't that make me a fake A? I took a deep breath and immediately forgot about you. The world is so beautiful. I will not be irritable. The vote solicitation chapter had long been deleted yesterday. Now, I can only continue to solicit monthly votes. As the saying goes, sending off a comrade, soliciting monthly votes. Speechless, 2 lines of tears. Third is about to be lost. Friends, please cast monthly votes to support Old Cat. Regardless of whether Fan Xian was afraid or not, the matter had already happened. However, during these years, perhaps the Emperor did not want to completely break off relations with the son he admired the most because of this matter. Or perhaps the Emperor only knew Fan Xian had entered the palace but did not think the chest was in Fan Xian's hands. Thus, he remained silent. It seemed that this was some kind of tacit agreement, not to pursue the matter, to express a father's indulgence toward his favorite son. Furthermore, Fan Xian was indeed ruthless to himself. Even when faced with a desperate situation, he rarely used that powerful weapon. The only time he had used it was in an uninhabited primitive mountain forest. Additionally, the key in Hongguang Palace's secret compartment was still there, making the Emperor guess some things incorrectly. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and sank into deep thought. He thought of the snow-like leaflets and how he had entered the palace to eavesdrop on the conversation between the eldest princess and Zhuang Mohan. His heart immediately relaxed. He understood that the Emperor must have thought he was only targeting the eldest princess, entering the palace to eavesdrop, and not for the key. But what about the letter? Fan Xian still could not understand. Tiredly, he sat on the side of the bed in silence. In reality, other than the matter of the chest possibly being exposed, his fear of the Emperor was also because of another puzzle. This was a problem that troubled Fan Xian. Regardless of whether he accepted it or not, no matter what, the Emperor was still one of his fathers, although he was certainly not the best one. In Fan Xian's heart, he had 3 fathers. Minister Fan was his closest biological father, and Chen Pingping could be considered a godfather. However, the Emperor's figure was also gradually invading his thoughts. Chen Pingping's words interrupted his train of thought. If you didn't enter the palace because you were afraid, then why didn't you return to the Overwatch Council and see me? Don't tell me you're afraid of me too. Looking at the old cripple's smiling appearance, Fan Xian sighed in his heart and thought, isn't he also afraid? I'm just afraid that after seeing you, I won't be able to resist asking some questions. Although he was afraid, he still opened his mouth to ask. Since he had the courage to come, he was naturally prepared. He did not want to be a pitiful zergling that was kept in the dark. How did Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers get to Dong Mountain? Why didn't the Overwatch Council have any intelligence? Why was the situation in Jingdo so dangerous? Why was there no news of the unusual movements of the officials of Dongshan Road? Why didn't you return to Jingdo and allow the eldest princess and Empress Dowager to torment you until you finally tormented yourself to death? This is the plan that His Majesty and I came up with. Of course, we have to hide it from the world. Chen Pingping glanced at him coldly and said, if I didn't show weakness first, how could these people jump out? Fan Xian shook his head. Don't lie to me. I know you can certainly give the Emperor a good explanation after this. Only you and I know that these people were forced by us to oppose the Emperor. Furthermore, you know that although the Emperor appears to have achieved great success this time, he is actually walking on a tightrope. The slightest bit of carelessness would cause him to fall into the bottomless abyss. Since you knew about this long ago, you must have the ability to make the situation better and not let Jingdo sink into a situation of eternal damnation. The Emperor trusts you, but that doesn't mean I trust you. Fan Xian stared at Chen Pingping's old face and lowered his voice. This is the Emperor's plan, but you've been going along with it. Although you've only pushed it a little, it has increased the danger the Qing kingdom faces by 10 times or even 100 times. Even if you want to get rid of internal trouble, you can't have so many people die. No matter how ruthless the emperor is, presumably, he wouldn't want to see this final situation. There are dogs in the world. Who would chase them? After a long silence, Chun Ping said, "If you want to beat the dogs, you have to beat them all to death." I'm afraid the emperor's heart will soften for a moment. Does this explanation make sense? It doesn't. Fan Xian shifted in his direction and held his thin hand. In a heavy voice, he said, "Even if it makes sense logically, the emperor's heart will not be comfortable, particularly if he thinks about it later. There will always be problems." What problems could there be? This is the emperor's grand plan. I am just an executor. Chun Ping very naturally pulled his hand out of Fan Xian's and coldly said, "Don't think too much. There aren't too many complicated things in this world." There aren't? Fan Xian's heart was filled with worry and anger. He stared in his eyes and said, "Then, tell me, why did you have the shadow assassinate the emperor at the Hanging Temple? Why did the old Qin master's body have an additional wound on the back of his waist?" Chun Ping slowly raised his head and furrowed his brows as he looked at Fan Xian. "You want to see the body?" Fan Xian nodded and said, "I know that was the shadow's attack." He paused and then smiled bitterly. "However, since I saw it, naturally, there's no wound now." "I didn't think you would be so meticulous," Chun Ping said. Chun Ping said, "I was the one who ordered the shadow to attack in the floating temple. You can report me to the king now. But you should know that the shadow has 2 mysterious identities. Aside from you and me, no one else knows this. Not even the king knows." Chun Ping nodded. Fan Xian angrily said, "Even so, you still won't say it." "Say what? Why did the old Qin master betray the emperor?" This was a question the eldest princess had Fan Xian ask Chun Ping before she died. Now, he finally bravely asked. Betrayal never needs a reason. Chun Ping was as cold and severe as ever. "You had the shadow kill Qin Yi. Were you afraid I would find out something from his mouth?" Chun Ping laughed coldly and couldn't be bothered to reply. He waved his hand to signal for the guest to leave. Fan Xian stared at him coldly. A moment later, his gaze helplessly softened. Using a pleading tone, he said, "I know you are afraid of dragging me down, which is why you want to separate. However, such a major matter, you have to think about yourself." Chun Ping's heart was filled with tenderness, but his face did not show it. "You're thinking too much." Fan Xian was silent and speechless. Although Chun Ping still refused to admit it, he knew from the other party's attitude that his guess was certainly correct. The Qin family must have participated in the Taiping courtyard matter. The reason for their betrayal was because of his rise. What kind of person was the old Qin master? Although he was old, he knew that if the emperor truly wanted to use Fan Xian, he would have to clean up the matter of the past. The Qin family must have died, so the Qin family must have rebelled. This was the logic. However, behind this logic was a bloody and sinister reality. Fan Xian stood and gazed at Chun Ping in silence for a moment. He then said, "After all, they're my father and mother. You've already worked hard for so many years. You should think about yourself more. I don't have many years left. You said it yourself." Chun Ping smiled. Fan Xian gazed at him with some bitterness and said, "No one can defeat him." Chun Ping was silent. Fan Xian prepared to leave when he suddenly said, "The chest is in my hands." Chun Ping abruptly raised his head and saw that the young man had already walked resolutely out the door. He couldn't help but shake his head. He thought, "So what if the chest is in your hands? I can't drag you into this matter." After an indeterminable amount of time, a middle-aged man in casual clothing walked into the side room Chun Ping was in and sat down beside him. It was exactly where Fan Xian had been sitting earlier. "No one could defeat the emperor," the middle-aged man said evenly. "On this point, my thoughts are the same as in Xi's." This middle-aged man was none other than Fan Xian's father, the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. No one knew when he'd come to Qin Garden or why he was speaking so calmly with Chun Ping. The legend in officialdom was that in the past dozen years, Chen Pingping and Fan Jian had always been like fire and water. It was not until Fan Xian entered the capital that the relationship between the two sides gradually improved. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and calmly said, "Do you know the chest is in his hands?" Fan Jian smiled bitterly and said, "This child, he put the chest under the bed and thought he could hide it from everyone under heaven. How cute." Chen Pingping opened his eyes and glanced at him. "In your own manner, do you not have the ability to help him keep a secret?" "I do have this ability," Fan Jian said evenly. "The Emperor has placed 2 spies in my home, and Ji discovered one a long time ago, and the other died a long time ago. In any case, these kinds of spies don't cost money, so the Emperor doesn't care." "Doesn't care?" If he didn't care, then he wouldn't have brought all of the Tiger Guards to Dong Mountain this time for that madman Sigajian to chop up for fun. Chen Pingping looked at him with slight mockery and said, "You've only cared about small things your entire life. All of your strength was put into those Tiger Guards. Now that they've all died, no matter how many people you hid inside, not a single one is left. The Emperor is truly ruthless this time." "Yes, I don't have much strength left." Fan Jian smiled bitterly. "So, I can only resign and return home." He looked at Chen Pingping and smiled coldly. "How much better can you be than me?" During the battle at Xingyang Gate, thousands of your Overwatch Council elites died. In another 2 years, the Emperor will add a few more grains of sand. Other than learning from me and retiring, what else can you do?" Chen Pingping laughed coldly and said, "As long as Fan Xian is still alive, the Emperor will not go all out against the Overwatch Council. What I have to worry about?" On the other hand, Lin Ruofu, that old fox, has endured for so long and finally found an opportunity to hand over all of the people he had hidden to his precious son-in-law. In the end, he is probably vomiting blood in Wuzhou right now. Fan Jian also smiled and said, "Everyone else thought that the officials of the Lin faction had followed in Ji to fight against the Crown Prince and would be heavily rewarded afterward. Unexpectedly, the Emperor had been waiting to see this scene. Seeing the last of Prime Minister Lin's people jump out, even if they can't do anything now, how can they have a chance to turn things around in the future? External enemies and internal troubles have all been eliminated. He has also chopped off half of our arms." Fan Jian sighed. "The Emperor can truly be said to be wise and mighty. He has exceptional talent in his heart. It must be admitted, just like when we began to follow him many years ago." Chen Pingping closed his eyes and slowly said, "He is, and will be the most powerful person in the world." After a death-like silence, Minister Fan sighed and said, "I hid in King Jing's manor in Jingdo because I was not worried about the situation in Jingdo. I had long seen that there was a problem with the Yi family. However, I had not thought that the Emperor was actually a great grandmaster. I had somewhat guessed at the Emperor's unfathomable power," Chen Pingping said coldly. "However, I had not thought that Yi Luyun, that strange old creature, would suddenly stand on the Emperor's side. The two of us only guessed one side of the Emperor." Minister Fan suddenly stopped talking. Chen Pingping knew what his old comrade was about to say and calmly said, "There is no if. After that matter, you were never willing to believe me, and I was never willing to believe you. I never thought that the person I should have trusted the most might have had some problems." "And Ji once said something," Minister Fan said. Minister Fan said, "If you and I had more trust in each other, perhaps things would have been much easier. It was at that time that I knew this son of mine was extraordinary. We hid it so well, yet he was still able to guess this matter. He is the son of Xiao Yi and the Emperor. Of course, he is extraordinary." Chen Pingping furrowed his brows. In his heart, he still had the highest respect and admiration for the Emperor. "When did you guess that the Emperor was a great grandmaster?" Minister Fan's heart was very light as he casually asked. "It's been a few years." Chen Pingping's brows gradually relaxed as he thought of the events of the past. At that time, the Wei Kingdom was still standing in the center of the land. The power of the country was very powerful. When the Qin Kingdom first went on a northern expedition, the battle was very difficult, particularly in one battle. At the time, the Emperor, who was still the crown prince, was heavily injured. His entire body was stiff and unable to move, and he almost lost his life. It was all thanks to Chen Pingping risking his life and going through many hardships to save him. This was one of Chen Pingping's most famous deeds. It was as famous as the Thousand Li surprise attack and the capture of Shaoan at the price of a broken leg. Minister Fan furrowed his brows and said, "What's wrong with that? We old people always thought that it was after that heavy injury that the emperor lost his martial arts. Back then, he was a fierce general. That injury was a bit strange," Chen Pingping slowly said. His entire body was stiff. It was definitely not caused by external injuries. Lady Ning and I took care of him all the way, so of course, we know that it should be a problem with his meridians. It seems that all his meridians were broken. We thought he was dead for sure and cried a few times. Who knew that he would come back alive in the end? I've never seen a person who can still live with all his meridians broken. Chen Pingping opened his eyes and looked at Fan Jian. Slowly, he said, "However, I later saw a similar person. It was your son." During the Hanging Temple incident, Fan Xian's meridians were also greatly damaged, but they were not as terrifying as the emperor's in the past. Furthermore, later in Jiangnan, he must have learned old Baldy Ku's skills and gradually recovered, Chen Pingping said. The emperor did not have Fan Xian's good luck. He did not learn Tianyi Dao, so how did his injury heal? These years, you've spent less time with the emperor than I have, Chen Pingping continued. Chen Pingping continued. No matter how much the emperor can endure, some details will always give the game away. Fei Jie reported back from Danzhou about the tyrannical martial method Fan Xian practiced and said that this tyrannical jinqi could cause serious consequences. It made me think of the emperor who was once stiff all over and looked like a cripple. The Hanging Temple incident wanted to force him a little and see what his trump card was. Unfortunately, it was blocked by Fan Xian. Speaking of this, he glared at Minister Fan. At that time, it was this father who wanted his son to save the emperor and instead ruined Chen Pingping's grand plan. Since you understand everything, then let's not talk about it anymore. You also have to think through this matter. Fan Jian stood freely and said, "I'm going back to Danzhou to retire. If you have time, you can come visit me." Chen Pingping was silent. He knew what his old comrade was thinking. Regardless of whether or not the emperor was undefeatable, who was, in the end, Fan Xian's biological father. No one knew that Fan Xian was a transmigrator. His soul carried a different element. These two elders only thought, based on common sense, that even if Fan Xian knew the truth, he would still be stuck in a dilemma. The two of them didn't want Fan Xian to live under too much pressure, so they had to think through this matter. Chen Pingping gently knocked on the copper bell beside the table. After a crisp ring, the old servant who had served him for many years walked in and carried him to the wheelchair. "I'll see you off." Chen Pingping lowered his head and coughed. It was a difficult cough. His sleeves were covered in spittle. It took a moment for it to calm down. He said self-mockingly, "My body is getting worse and worse. I've been poisoned, and I can't cure it for a long time." Fan Jian looked at him quietly and didn't say anything. He walked out of the manor. Behind him, the old servant pushed the wheelchair and followed. They didn't walk very far. In front of the construction site, the two of them stopped, looked at each other, and bowed. "I've thought it through," Chen Pingping said to Fan Jian. Fan Jian didn't immediately reply. Instead, he lowered his head and thought for a moment. He didn't know if these words were true or false. He knew why Chen Pingping had come to see him off. Many years ago, they had once gone to the shores of the East Sea and gathered together in Taiping Courtyard. They had once created a great situation. However, as time passed, some people had died, some people had changed, and some people had to retreat. He had resigned and returned to Danzhou. Only Chen Pingping was left in Jingdou to accompany the emperor. Presumably, he should also feel lonely. Just as Fan Xian said, during these dozen years, he and Chen Pingping had suspected each other. Their interactions had gradually decreased, but could not erase the comradeship of the past. When it was time to withdraw from the stage, it had to be completely withdrawn. Back then, Lin Ruofu was not a member of the three-man group, so his withdrawal was not thorough enough. Minister Fan would not make this mistake. In front of the emperor's might, other than retiring, they did not seem to have any good choice. Before Fan Jian left, he furrowed his brows and asked one last question. He did not avoid the old servant. "Since you suspected me back then, why did you have Wu Zhu take him to Danzhou?" Chen Pingping sat in the wheelchair and lowered his head for a moment. He then slowly replied, "Because I know you once paid a price for it, so I want to continue to see your heart." A self-mocking and sad smile rose to the corners of Fan Jian's lips. He waved his hand and didn't say anything more. Watching Fan Jian's departing figure, Chen Pingping gently leaned against the wheelchair. His finger unconsciously tapped against the armrest of the wheelchair. He sighed and quietly said, "It's good that he's gone. It's good that he's gone." Immediately after, the leader of the Qing Kingdom's darkness said gloomily to himself, "In the end, he is his father. How could I bear to force him?" The old servant silently pushed the wheelchair back and listened to the old director say tiredly, "Tell me, why is it so difficult for someone to die?" Chen Pingping had done countless earth-shattering things in his life and faced countless dangers and hardships, but he had never been as disappointed as he was today. The enemy he faced was, without question, the most powerful person he had ever met in his life. Furthermore, that person could not find any weakness. The old servant said in a raspy voice, "It shouldn't implicate the Duke." He could already see the heaviness in his master's heart, so he did his best to ease it. "Even if the Emperor can find something after the Hanging Temple and in Little Snow Valley, I have already caused Enji to almost lose his life twice. Is this still not enough to sever my relationship with him? Enji's luck has always been good. The Emperor will certainly not suspect him. Let's just let this matter rest." Chen Pingping was slightly afraid of the cold and pulled the blanket closer to his body. Fan Jian was ready to leave. Chen Pingping had given up, and Fan Xian had thought it through. The biggest problem in the world seemed to have been solved. However, all three of them knew that if there were no major disturbances in the future, then this pot of boiling oil could be safely covered by the lid. But if something were to happen, the oil would jump out and burn everything cleanly, not to mention the fact that the boiling oil was in their hearts, and it would burn them to the point where they hissed in pain. Chapter 592. Outside Shanjing, heading north from Shi Mountain, one came to the green and serene mountain. This mountain appeared normal, but in the hearts of the people, it was unusual. This was where the Tianyi Dao school was. Master Ku He's disciples and grand disciples studied and practiced here. After they left the mountain, they pointed their swords at the world and helped the people in need. Now, Qing Mountain was filled with sadness. All of the Tianyi Dao disciples looked at the black building at the top of the mountain with uneasy expressions. They clenched their fists tightly and pressed their lips together. Their eyes showed fear, and they didn't say a word. Occasionally, people would pass by the stone path and head toward the top of the mountain. Their faces were heavy, and they didn't even glance at these Tianyi Dao disciples. There were many people going up the mountain. They were of high status, including many nobles, officials, and famous generals in Shanjing, such as the Grand Tutor Zhuang Mohan had single-handedly taught, Chang Ningho, various officials, and about half of them were students who had left the mountain. Now, they had all returned to the mountain, other than Shang Shanhu, leading the southern border to resist the attacks of the Qing Kingdom's Yanjing and Sangzhou's northern expedition camp. All of the talented and powerful figures in the northern Qi court had gathered on Qing Mountain because of this matter. In other words, northern Qi Shanjing, the center of politics, had completely shifted to Qing Mountain. The Tianyi Dao disciples guessed what had happened at the top of the mountain. Only that major matter would alarm so many people. Their faces grew increasingly sorrowful. At noon, the northern Qi emperor, dressed in casual clothes, stepped onto the stone path up the mountain with a heavy expression. By his side was Lang Tiao. Behind him was Friar He. Guards were scattered at the foot of the mountain path. They didn't wear dragon robes and didn't display their royal chariots. Instead, they hurried up the mountain with dark expressions. The Tianyi Dao disciples knelt on either side of the stone path. They felt even more fearful. They knew that the protector of the Qi kingdom, the Grand Master closest to a god, was about to leave this world. On Dong Mountain, the tyrannical Jinshi that the Qing Emperor had cultivated for decades poured into Master Ku He's body with the power of the way of the Emperor. The accumulation of decades of cultivation was like an ocean. In an instant, it burst apart Master Ku He's old body. Being carried back into northern Qi territory by Shang Shanhu, Master Ku, he sat cross-legged in the Qingshan Taoist school without a word. He had not eaten a grain of rice, and his expression was calm. The skin on his body began to gradually split open, revealing the blood vessels and tendons within. It began to disintegrate. It looked very terrifying. Fortunately, a large, soft robe was draped over the great Grandmaster's body, preventing the disciples who were serving him from feeling any more sorrowful. Since early in the morning, there had been an endless stream of people coming from Shangjing. The various nobles and officials all wore the etiquette of a disciple to pay their respects. After seeing Master Ku He, they knew that this should be the last time they would see the imperial advisor. The second disciple, Mu Peng, who had not been able to rest in peace even before his death, had been nervously adjusting his master's breathing. The expression on his face was somewhat vicious, but he could not say anything. The summons before his death was an order from Master Ku He. Each person only saw a moment. It was only when they saw the Grand Tutor that he said a few more words. He had protected this country for decades. Today, he was going to leave. Even though he understood life and death, there was still something he could not let go of, this country. Today was his final farewell to this country and his final account. Regardless of whether the Grandmaster died or not, his words would certainly have a great influence on this country. Thus, he wanted to use his last moments to say a few words to these officials who controlled the Northern Qi court. He wanted to lay a more stable foundation for the Emperor's future governance. He looked at the military general in front of him and unconsciously sank into some kind of deep thought. There was nothing wrong with the Emperor's ability. It was just that he was still young. Although Shan Zhong had been executed and Shang Shanhu had submitted, if he truly died, would he be able to control the power of the military? The military general was the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs. After receiving a few words from the imperial advisor, he didn't hear any sound. He couldn't help but raise his head in fear to glance. In northern Qi, regardless of whether it was the royal family or the generals, they all had boundless respect for Master Ku He. Ku He was different from the Qing kingdom's Yiluyan. From the beginning, he had spread his influence and power into every crevice in the northern Qi court. The second disciple of Tianyi Dao, Mu Peng, moved closer to his teacher's ear and quietly said, "The Emperor and Empress Dowager have both arrived. Should we call them in?" In the entire world, only Ku He had the right to call the Emperor and Empress Dowager. Ku He calmly shook his head. When the skin on his neck touched slightly with his clothing, there was a tearing pain. This kind of pain was, without question, something that humans could not endure. However, it was as if he didn't feel anything. He only furrowed his brows slightly. Mu Peng knelt to his teacher's left. Looking at the bloody marks on the back of his teacher's clothing, his heart was filled with grief. He couldn't resist crying. With this cry, the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs kneeling in front of Master Ku, he also felt sorrow. Adding to his fear for Northern Qi's future, his eyes grew wet. He knelt and crawled 2 steps forward. Fiercely kowtowing 3 times in front of Master Ku He gritted his teeth and said, "General Shang Shanhu is in the south, and I am in Shangjing. Unless we die, we will not allow the court to be harmed in the slightest. Even if we die, we will protect the Emperor's safety." Ku He glanced at him with a gentle gaze and warmly said, "It's been 12 years since you left the mountains. The future of the Qi kingdom needs your heart and your life." The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs kowtowed again, gritted his teeth, stood up, and left. As he walked out the door, his eyes were slightly red. Unexpectedly, he saw the ashen-faced emperor and couldn't help but sigh. The Northern Qi emperor had been waiting outside the room for a long time. Seeing his official's slightly red eyes, his heart thumped as if it had sunk into an endless abyss. Raising his feet, he charged into the room. Beside him, Lang Tiao pulled on his sleeve. The Northern Qi Emperor turned his head and glared coldly at Lang Tiao. Unconsciously, Lang Tiao felt a glimmer of fear. Although the emperor had followed him to learn martial arts, he still did not have much talent in martial arts. However, the might of an emperor grew stronger and stronger. "You can come in." Master Ku He's voice faintly rang out from outside the room. The Northern Qi Emperor tidied up his clothing. With a serious expression, he turned and led the Empress Dowager's hand into the room. Inside the doors at the top of the mountain, other than Ku He, who was sitting on the ground like a withered tree, there were only a few of his closest disciples, as well as the Emperor and Empress Dowager. He was indeed like a withered tree. Although there was a wide and soft robe covering the great Grandmaster's body, everyone who saw Ku He felt a chill in their hearts. It was as if, through the thin robe, they could see the cracks on the Imperial Advisor's body like a dry field, as well as the faint bloodstains on his collar. Such a heavy injury was indeed impossible to heal. The Northern Qi Emperor's heart chilled. Without any pretense, he knelt cleanly in front of Ku He and kowtowed one last time to him. "Granduncle." Everyone under heaven bowed to the emperor. The emperor never bowed to anyone. However, the Northern Qi Emperor had bowed to Ku He twice and kowtowed twice. The first time was when he was very young. At that time, the previous emperor had just passed away. The Empress Dowager had held the little emperor as they sat in the beautiful main hall of the royal palace in Shangjing and kowtowed to Master Ku He. Ku He had guaranteed the safety of the mother and son for over a dozen years. He had ensured that the Northern Qi royal family was surnamed War and allowed the little emperor to grow up. This second kowtow was the Northern Qi Emperor bidding farewell to his granduncle. In his heart, he had always felt a sense of distance and fear toward this deified granduncle. However, he felt even more gratitude. The Empress Dowager sat by Ku He's side. She lowered her head and wept silently. "All right, who won't die?" Ku He lowered his eyes slightly and quietly said, "I've already lived for so many years. It can be said that I have benefited greatly from heaven. Everyone will die, and that person in the Qing kingdom is no exception." Ku He had not personally spoken of the truth of what happened on Dong Mountain. Shang Shanhu had only guessed a little and reported it to the royal palace in Shangjing. Hearing Master Ku He say this, the Northern Qi Emperor's heart chilled. He knew that it was indeed so. His counterpart in the Qing kingdom was extremely powerful. Looking at the emperor's expression, Ku He lightly said, "Are you afraid?" The Northern Qi Emperor pressed his lips tightly together. He didn't know how to reply. In his life, he had been the goal the Qing Emperor had fought for. He even faintly saw the Qing Emperor as his idol. He only thought that one day he would defeat the Qing Emperor. Now, he found that the Qing Emperor's silent endurance these dozen years was all an illusion. Such a far-sighted emperor was much more experienced and ruthless than him. Furthermore, the Qing Emperor was a great grandmaster. "Fear is a very normal emotion," Ku He faintly said. Ku He faintly said, "When his finger touched the space between my brows, even I felt a glimmer of fear. This person has the heart of an emperor and the strength of a great grandmaster. There is not a single weakness or opening on him. Most terrifying of all is his perseverance. For the sake of his goal of sweeping through the wilderness, he was able to plan for decades. He was single-minded and never made any mistakes. Such a person is not like a person at all." Ku He smiled slightly and gave the Qing Emperor an evaluation. "Everyone falsely claims that I am the one closest to a god in the world. No one knows that the one in the south, who is emotionless, without hate, without love, and without separation, is the true God. Is there really nothing we can do about the Qing Emperor?" The person who asked this question in a trembling voice was Lang Tiao. He knew that the emperor also wanted to ask this question. However, as an emperor, he could not speak. A person who stands at the pinnacle of martial arts, worldly power, and wisdom. Such a person is naturally impossible to defeat. Ku He was a bit tired. He closed his eyes and said, "It is basically impossible to defeat him from the outside." The Northern Qi Emperor was still kneeling in front of Ku He. Two glimmers of emotion flashed through his eyes. Suddenly, he bowed and said, "Granduncle, I'm going to worship the temple." The temple. When these two words came out of the emperor's mouth, the entire room fell silent. None of the 6 people said anything. Lang Tiao and Bai Shun met each other's eyes and saw the shock in the other's eyes. Mu Peng gently supported his teacher's body and glanced at the emperor with astonishment. In an instant, the emotions in the eyes of the 3 eldest disciples of Tianyi, Dao, became serious and faintly excited. In the present world, no one could defeat the Qing emperor. However, there was still the temple. Given the power of an immortal, was there nothing they could do against a mortal? The temple was illusory. It was only a myth or legend. The 6 people in a room all knew that after Shaoan's death, there was only one person who knew of the temple's existence and where it was. It was Ku He. The Northern Qi Emperor had never given up on the thought of worshipping the temple and obtaining the support of a mysterious power. Back then, he had wholeheartedly rescued and imprisoned Shaoan. He had even clashed head-on with Ku He's faction because he wanted to know the secret in Shaoan's mind. The temple. Master Ku He slowly opened his eyes and looked at the emperor kneeling in front of him. The Northern Qi Emperor had thought that his granduncle's gaze would be sharp and angry because the only person in the world who had been to the temple was him. Furthermore, he had always hidden the true existence of the temple from the entire world at all costs. However, there was only faint mockery in Ku He's eyes, as well as the glimmer of a complicated smile. He knew, including his disciple, that when faced with the powerful Qing ruler, everyone unconsciously had the thought that they could not defeat him. That was why they had placed their hopes on the illusory temple. I know where the temple is. Ku He once again slowly closed his eyes. But I won't tell you. Shock appeared on the faces of everyone beside him. They thought, if you're going to take this secret to the yellow dirt, how can the Qi kingdom be protected? Ku He closed his eyes and quietly said, "The temple is just a pair of eyes. It has never interfered with the affairs of the world. Why disturb it?" Without waiting for anyone to reply, a self-mocking smile appeared at the corners of Ku He's lips. "Besides, do you really think the temple is omnipotent?" He opened his eyes and stared at the emperor in front of him. With sincere and heartfelt words, he said, "Don't place your hopes on something that does not exist in hope. Your Majesty, before I went to Dong Mountain this time, I met with Sigu Jian and made sufficient preparations for the situation at the top of the mountain." Ku He looked at him and faintly said, "Do you know what we think the Qing Emperor's final trump card is?" The Northern Qi Emperor shook his head in confusion. Although he was a supreme being, he still felt fear towards strange existences like the Great Grandmaster and the temple. Sigu Jian and I thought that the Qing Emperor's final support was someone from the temple. Ku He smiled warmly, but everyone else in the room was shocked. Did the Qing Emperor have secret connections with the temple? Ku He smiled slightly and said, "If it was only someone from the temple, then there is nothing to fear. What we fear is that the temple will break its own rules. However, the Qing Emperor does not have the power to do this." No one in the world understood the temple better than Ku He. Although his understanding of the outside world was only a shallow level, he understood that person. That was enough. The temple did not interfere in worldly affairs. If someone truly came to help the Qing Emperor, then the black-clothed blind man at the top of the mountain would certainly stand on the other side of the temple. This was why Ku He had never worried about this matter. There are no immortal emperors or saviors in this world. Ku He sighed and thought of the words that a mortal had once said to him and Shao in many, many years ago. When you reach the realm of a great grandmaster, you will discover that the temple is actually nothing more than this. An existence that does not appear in the world is no different from a dead object. Although he was about to die, his light words revealed a calm and accurate evaluation of the temple. Then what should we do? Although the fire in the Northern Qi Emperor's heart still burned, and he would not give up on the thought of finding the temple, because of a few words from Master Ku He knew he couldn't ask anymore. Granduncle Ku, he didn't have much time. When a person cannot be knocked down from the outside, We can only hope that some problems will appear on the inside, Ku-he said quietly. If the Qing kingdom wants to send an army north, it will take at least 3 years. Your Majesty must think of all ways to delay this time a bit longer. Delay? The Northern Qi Emperor repeated this in his heart and furrowed his brows. This was only a temporary solution. The longer we delay, the more beneficial it is for us because no one knows what will happen on the Qing kingdom's side. You're talking about Fan Xian? The Northern Qi Emperor looked at Ku-he's old appearance in shock. Pressing his thin lips together, he firmly shook his head. Fan Xian is not enough to change the Qing Emperor's mind. No one can. Furthermore, he is, after all, a Qing person. He cannot stand on the side of the Qi kingdom. Who knows? Master Ku, he looked at him with a calm gaze. Fan Xian has always been different from anyone else. He is the Qing Emperor's illegitimate child. Furthermore, the Qing Emperor trusts him greatly. The Northern Qi Emperor calmly expressed an opposing opinion. The Northern Qi Emperor calmly expressed an opposing opinion. What I can give him, the Qing Emperor can give him even more. Besides, even if he votes for me, it would be impossible for him to cause any harm to the situation under heaven. But you forgot, he is also the son of a young lady of the Yi family. Kui's smile appeared somewhat strange. Furthermore, you still underestimate Fan Xian's use. Don't always think of him as an immortal poet, a prince of the Qing kingdom, or a powerful official. These all appear to be important figures. His most important identity is actually the son of a young lady of the Yi family. He has already inherited and grasped many important things. The Northern Qi Emperor's heart jumped. He raised his head in astonishment to look at Master Ku-he. Huge waves churned in his heart. He understood the meaning behind his grandfather's words, but he did not dare believe it. To be able to share the benefits of the Jiangnan Palace treasury through Fan Xian's hands was already the best situation the Northern Qi Emperor could imagine. However, hearing his granduncle's meaning, he was hoping that Fan Xian would move the entire palace treasury to Northern Qi. Something like a great grandmaster can be used to create chaos in a country, but it cannot be used to conquer a country or build a country. Ku, he said warmly. The Qing Emperor will not go so far as to challenge the world alone. Military power and national power cannot be lacking. At the end of a war, it still relies on national power. Unless the Qing Emperor runs to Shangjing and becomes the enemy of tens of thousands of people. Kui's smile became amused. But he is such a serious person who wishes to write his glorious name in history. How could he be as crazy as Sigurjin? The Northern Qi Emperor's lips were slightly dry. He still could not believe Ku-he's judgment. Fan Xian, he refused to be a prince. What right did he have to vote for him? Was it because of the agreement between him and Haitang? Who would believe that an empty agreement with no proof would make Fan Xian pay such a large price? Everyone else was silent, listening to the conversation between Ku-he and the Northern Qi Emperor. Ku-he gazed at the Emperor and quietly said, "Even if you place your hopes on Fan Xian, you cannot show anything in these 2 years." Understood. I will immediately make arrangements to act against Fan Xian. Ku-he nodded and felt gratified in his heart. The Emperor was indeed extraordinarily intelligent. He had only mentioned it slightly, and he already knew what to do to not arouse the Qing Emperor's suspicions. As I said earlier, stall for time, Ku-he said with his head lowered. After I die, Mu Peng immediately go down the mountain to the Qing kingdom. Everyone looked at Ku-he in surprise. They didn't know why he was giving his second disciple, Mu Peng, a mission at this time. Although there were not many Tianyi Dao disciples, of the 4 disciples, Mu Peng had always been the most low-key and the weakest link. Other than medical skills, he had nothing else to rely on. You live on a mountain for a long time. Not many people in the outside world know what you look like. Ku-he gently coughed, but used his hand to cover it, not letting the blood spray out. Looking at his second disciple beside him, he said in an even voice, "I want you to go to the Qing kingdom. You don't need to do anything. Just think of a way to treat Chun Pingping's illness." Treat Chun Pingping's illness? Everyone was shocked. Who was Chun Pingping? He was the Qing Emperor's closest and most loyal official. Regardless of whether it was 30 years ago or the Dong Mountain incident that had just happened in Jingdo, Chen Pingping had played the greatest role. Hearing that the Qing Emperor's old dog's health was getting worse and worse, and that he didn't have many years left to live, the people of northern Qi and Dongyi all felt joy in their hearts. Yet, Master Ku, he had his disciple with extraordinary medical skills go treat his illness. Kui stared at Mu Peng sternly. No matter what, I want you to guarantee that Chen Pingping will be able to live and will not die of natural causes like sickness. These were heavy words. Although Mu Peng did not understand, he still lowered his head and agreed. Everyone in the room looked at Kui as if they wanted to hear an explanation. Kui was silent and did not speak. This was Kui's last move before he died. After stabilizing the internal politics of the Qi kingdom, he had turned his gaze to the south. He had already thrown out 2 moves. Chen Pingping's side was the one he pulled back from. Master Ku, he was not the emperor of the Qing kingdom. He did not weave a shocking situation that spanned decades. Instead, he had acutely captured a glimmer of light based on his understanding of that little fairy from a long, long time ago. Through his decades of spying on human nature, as well as the Dong Mountain matter and some existences that had been slightly eliminated, he was guessing. He guessed that behind the current peace in the Qing kingdom hid an old trouble that tore apart people's hearts. If Chen Pingping died of illness or natural old age, then Kui's guesses about human nature would not be of any use. Thus, he had to ensure that Chen Pingping could live on well until one day in the future when someone did not want him to continue living. Everything seemed to have been arranged. Kui had no more hopes for this world. He closed his eyes as if he was about to fall asleep. The Empress Dowager forcefully suppressed the sorrow and fear in her heart. In a trembling voice, she said, "How will the Taoist sect be dealt with in the future?" Tianyi Dao's Taoist sect was deeply rooted in the kingdom. The ascetic monks traveled through most of the world. Faintly, they still had some connection to the Qing temple system in the Qing kingdom. With such a great power, how exactly would they be dealt with after Kui's death? However, there were Kui's 3 main disciples in the sect. Due to their status, they could not open their mouths to ask. Kui's eyes remained closed as if he was tired. In a quiet voice, he said, "Hand the Taoist sect to Haitang." Everyone bowed and accepted the order. The 3 main disciples, including Lang Tiao, were not surprised. The Emperor and Empress Dowager also knew that Kui had already made this decision many years ago. Everyone had long seen Haitang as the next leader of Tianyi Dao. However, where was Haitang today? Everyone had questions in their hearts. It was said that Haitang was still on the mountain last night, but her whereabouts were unknown. When Master Kui was about to die, his most beloved disciple, the successor of Tianyi Dao, was not by the master's side. "Haitang has gone to do some things," Kui said quietly with his eyes closed. "She will not return during these 3 years. The matters of Tianyi Dao will be handed to Lang Tiao, and this mountain will be handed to your little sister, disciple." He said these words to Lang Tiao and the other 2. Although the matters of Tianyi Dao were handed to Lang Tiao, the mountain was the true foundation of Tianyi Dao. Little sister, disciple. Lang Tiao and the other 2 disciples looked at each other. Was he referring to the young lady of the Fan family? The Northern Qi Emperor's pupils constricted slightly. He immediately understood the meaning of these words. He began to prepare in his heart how to use this matter. Suppress Xia Mingji and allow Fan Ruo's name to shine brightly on the mountain. The imperial advisor was indeed skilled. The more he did this, the more the Qing emperor would suspect that Northern Qi was purposely provoking him. On the contrary, he would not suspect Fan Xian. It would be safer for Northern Qi's last hope of survival. However, until now, the Northern Qi emperor still did not believe that Fan Xian would one day come to his country with an incomparably generous dowry. After handing over all the mundane matters, Kui closed his lips and didn't say another word. He calmly felt the life in his body flow away. Other than a slight sense of loss, there was also a glimmer of joyful understanding. It was as if everything that had happened these years floated before his eyes. In the end, those scenes stopped decades ago on that seemingly endless patch of white snow. In his last moments, he thought of the shrieking vultures in the sky and his subordinates who had fallen dead on the way. The never-ending night, the faint light in the tent in the darkness, the silent Shao-in, and the neatly arranged human arms at the edge of the tent. It was an incomparably majestic black-green temple built against the mountain. The blind man who killed his way out of the temple. The little girl who ran out of the temple. Human flesh was not very tasty. He had already lived for so many years and knew what the temple was like. What was there to be dissatisfied with? Just like this, the great Grandmaster he sank into his memories and passed away with a complicated smile. On an icy plain to the north of northern Xi, a girl wearing clothes woven from animal skin was using the man language to greet the people of her tribe. The girl's face was bright red and full of smiles, but a faint sadness and confusion appeared in her eyes. The continuous years of snowstorms made it impossible for the northern man to survive on this wasteland. Thus, the tribe that the famous General Shang Shanhu had been unable to subdue for many years began to move around the tall sky veins and toward the warmer south. Many tribes had already settled on the grasslands to the northwest of the Qin kingdom. However, they had paid the price of many lives to obtain the acceptance of their distant relatives. There were also some tribes, as well as the old, weak women who lived on the ice and snow wasteland to the north. Perhaps because the number of tribes had decreased greatly, the small amount of prey was able to support these people's survival. Not long ago, a girl who was said to have been lost from the Ka-Erna tribe came to these tribes and began to follow everyone to hunt and herd sheep. Everyone liked this girl because she was diligent and capable. No matter how fierce a horse was, it could only be obedient in her hands. No matter how fierce a beast was, it seemed to be afraid of hurting her and would run far away. The simple and straightforward man, people just didn't like the way this Ka-Erna girl walked. In such a difficult environment, that kind of wobbly walking method seemed to waste too much energy. Chapter 593. On the last day, the situation for monthly votes is too dangerous. If anyone still has monthly votes, please vote them for me. Thank you. The flowers in the forest withered, the red of the spring. The summer dream, the autumn wind, too hurried. It was another winter in the Qin kingdom. The temperature seemed to have dropped within a day. Snow began to fall on the Tsang Mountains in the west of the capital. The mountain tops gradually turned white. 2 small bouts of cold rain fell in Jingdo, adding to the chill. The people on the streets were wrapped in thick cotton robes. They rubbed their hands and walked with hurried expressions. The carriages coming and going on Tianhe Avenue exchanged blows with the ground, making an irritating, monotonous sound. The horses all breathed out impatiently and turned their heads. It was as if they wanted the winter to end faster. In a black carriage, Fan Xian flipped up his fur collar and blew a breath of hot air into his hands. He tightened the fur cloak on his body and muttered a few words. He thought to himself that the winter had come too quickly. He had just come out of King Jing's manor. King Jing was sick, very sick. Hongsheng was not in the capital. Rojiao was also young. Fan Xian could only take on the role of an assistant. Every day, he went to serve the medicine, talk with him, and relieve the king's boredom. Given his present identity, it was indeed inappropriate for him to do such things. However, Fan Xian knew the relationship between King Jing's family and his own. Furthermore, he had always felt some remorse toward Hongsheng, so he was particularly attentive. He knew why King Jing, who looked old but was actually in good health, had suddenly come down with a cold. None of this had anything to do with the winter. It was only related to the severe cold in the royal family. The Empress Dowager had died, the eldest princess had died, and half of King Jing's family had died in this incident. The cruel reality had finally knocked down the flower farmer king. Coming out of King Jing's manor, Fan Xian did not return directly to the manor. He also did not enter the palace. Instead, he went to Baiwa brothel. Today was the day Chanli and Sang returned to the capital to report on their work. He had to learn the most secretive information in the world from the mouths of these two trusted aides. After staying in the building for a while, Fan Xian looked over the information that Baoyue Brothel had gathered from the tentacles they had spread all over the world. He furrowed his brows and looked at Sang Wen's gentle face. He looked at the beard growing on Chanli's lips and sighed. There was nothing special about this information. It was similar to the Overwatch Council's. 3 months had passed since the Dong Mountain incident. The entire world had entered winter. As early as 2 months ago, news of Master Ku He's death had spread from northern Qi. The death of a great Grand Master shocked the people of the world, but did not surprise Fan Xian too much. This was something that the Emperor had already predicted. Fan Xian was only wary of what northern Qi would do in response to Ku He's death. During these 2 months, northern Qi had been very quiet. Other than Shang Shanhu continuously defending against the Qing Kingdom's probing attacks in the south, there had been no major movements. Fan Xian lowered his head and smiled as he thought about it. If Xia Mingji's stronghold in Shangjing was not taken into account, the northern Qi Emperor had finally taken action against Fan Xizha. It was said that the second Fan Elder was living in fear and unease in Shangjing. However, Fan Xian was not worried at all. From his sister's letter, he could tell at a glance exactly what the little emperor wanted to do and express to him. What made Fan Xian uneasy was that Haitang Duo, this woman who had a close relationship with him and the successor of Tianyi Dao, had suddenly disappeared without a trace. No one knew where she had gone. Even the internal members of Tianyi Dao did not know. He did not know that a famous doctor called Fengshan had already entered Jingdou and was beginning to make a name for himself. He had received the attention of the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Because of his northern Qi identity, he was still unable to enter the palace as an attendant. Instead, he was sent to the manors of various officials to demonstrate the emperor's favor. King Jing's illness was personally treated by Fan Xian, so Sir Fengshan had never met Fan Xian. No matter how clever Fan Xian was, he would not be able to guess that, in the near future, Sir Fengshan would go to Chung Garden to carefully protect Director Chen's life at all costs. The chess moves coup he had made before his death were all loose pieces. On their own, they did not have any effect. They only ensured that the internal situation in the Qing Kingdom would continue to move step by step in a certain direction. Fan Xian was only worried about Haitang. He didn't know what coup he had told Haitang, when he would see her, or with what identity he would see her. There was also something that made the entire Qing court feel fear. Ku was already dead. Northern Qi did not hold a funeral in secret. Instead, they held the ceremony with great fanfare. Hundreds of thousands of officials and commoners from various roads and provinces went to cry for the soul. The Northern Qi court did not seem to sink into a state of panic or unease because of Ku He's death. Sigu Jian, who should have already died in Dongyi according to the Qing Emperor's calculations, had stubbornly held on and not died. This sword saint's body was as valiant as a cockroach. Although his breathing was weak and his life hung by a thread, he held on to this thread tightly and refused to let go. The dying Sigu Jian was hidden in the sword hut. Although this sword saint had become a cripple, his reputation was still there. All of Dongyi seemed to have a pillar of support. Problems also began to appear within Dongyi. After Sigu Jian's death, the dispute between the master of the city's manor and the sword hut was perhaps about to surface. For the Qing Emperor, Sigu Jian's life and death was no longer a problem. After his death, the ownership of Dongyi was the major problem. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought. Dongyi was different from northern Qi and the Qing Kingdom. It was isolated by the sea and surrounded by vassal states. If Sigu Jian died, a ferocious beast would immediately become a delicious, tender piece of meat waiting to be cut. Regardless of whether it was the Northern Qi Emperor or his own emperor, neither would let go of this piece of fresh meat. However, he didn't know who the emperor would send to steal it. He raised his head and glanced at Shi Chanli and Sang Wen. He briefly told Shi Chanli about the situation in the Jiangnan Palace treasury. Although Su Wenmao endlessly sent him secret reports, Fan Xian still trusted Shi Chanli's instinctive impression more. The production of the palace treasury continued to maintain high efficiency. With Fan Xian's strong cooperation, the old shopkeepers of the Seven Leaves gradually raised the level of the three workshops to the level of the old Yi family. Fan Xian's heart felt slightly more at ease. He had two knives in his hands. One was the Overwatch Council, and the other was the palace treasury. Regardless of whether it was for the emperor's trust or for his own power, he had to hold on tight and do a good job. Of Fan Xian's four disciples, only Shi Chanli remained by Fan Xian's side. Hou Jichang, Yang Wanli, and Cheng Jialan were all fighting up in their respective positions. With Fan Xian's protection and financial support, in addition to their own abilities, presumably, it wouldn't be long before they became important figures in the Qin court. There are many vacancies in the court. The emperor has chosen many young people. At this time, age and experience are no longer important. Fan Xian gazed at Shi Chanli and smiled warmly. In a moment, write a letter to the three of them and have them prepare. At the beginning of spring, the court will probably summon them to the capital to report on their work. In his arrangements, Yang Wanli should be working in the Ministry of Works. Because Hou Jichang had handled the Jiaozhou matter, his position was particularly stable and deeply admired by the emperor. He should be directly promoted by 2 levels and become Jiaozhou Zhizhou. As for Cheng Jialan, his path had been smooth sailing. He was probably the most glorious person in the Suzhou government. Shi Chanli's mouth was slightly open. He had not expected that the 4 poor scholars would each have such good fortune in just a few years. He truly cannot catch up. Fan Xian knew what he was thinking and asked with a smile, "What is it?" Their experience is too shallow and cannot convince the masses. Most importantly, everyone in court knows that the 3 of them are your students. I'm afraid it will cause criticism, Shi Chanli said seriously. Fan Xian raised his eyelids slightly and mockingly said, "A few hundred officials have died. Someone has to fill in. Where would there be so many candidates with experience? Don't say his experience is shallow." Back then, He Zongwei was as famous as Hou Jichang and entered the court after Jichang. Now, he already has the right to enter the royal study to listen to discussions. Is his experience deep enough? He Zongwei was a name that Fan Xian had a deep memory of. Back then, in the restaurant of Yishir Tavern, he had met this seemingly honest young scholar. It was this scholar who caused many things in Jingdou in the future, such as his father-in-law being forced to tragically resign. This person was originally on good terms with Guo Baoquan, the son of Guiyu, the Minister of Rights. He was on the Crown Prince's side through and through. Later on, he became an imperial censor in the imperial censorate and began to advise the second prince. Later on, he switched sides with the Crown Prince. After switching sides twice, people finally realized that he was on the eldest princess's side. He was just following the eldest princess's wishes. However, during the Jingdou Rebellion, it was this imperial censor of the left who led a group of imperial censors to run around naked. He gambled that the Crown Prince, Li Changxian, could not bear to kill people and forcefully delayed the rebel army's entry into the capital for a night. This gave Fan Xian the opportunity to launch a surprise attack on the royal palace, control the center, and reverse the situation in one move. Only now did people truly see clearly that He Zongwei was no one's man. He was only the emperor's man. He had always been. The emperor had returned to the capital, and He Zongwei had been rewarded for his great service. He climbed up like a rocket. Although he only held his original position in the imperial censorate, he had the right to discuss matters in the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Anyone with a discerning eye knew that imperial censor, he might one day take over the position of the already old Shu the scholar. His future was bright and immeasurable. During the turmoil in Jingdou, He Zongwei had helped Fan Xian greatly. Even though he was now in a high position of power, each time he ran into Fan Xian in court or outside, he was still incomparably respectful. There was nothing to nitpick about and appeared exceptionally humble. However, Fan Xian disliked this person. Perhaps it was because he had seen this person's burning desire for power a long time ago. Perhaps it was because he disliked this kind of person who sold others to climb up. Perhaps it was because he had once punched He Zongwei, and he knew that someone like He Zongwei would certainly hold a grudge. Fan Xian was not afraid of his own way. However, he had to be on guard because he was greatly admired by the emperor. Petty people were always more terrifying than noble people. Presently, the private discussion of his own way in the officialdom was somewhat unbearable. They gave him the nickname of a traitor. Everyone felt that this nickname was very fitting. Not many people knew that this nickname had come from the fan manner study. Sometimes, Fan Xian asked himself honestly, the things his own way did were not more shameless than what he did. Why did he hate him so much? In reality, it was very simple. Fan Xian had once seen his own way's burning and greedy gaze toward Ruoruo. Because of this gaze, he remembered him for a lifetime. He wanted to suppress him for a lifetime and make it so that he would never be able to rise again. I didn't think that right now. Your sister will be singing in Qin Garden. Fan Xian glanced at Sangwon and smiled. He liked Sangwon very much. She was gentle, silent, and amiable. It wasn't that he had any romantic thoughts about her. He just felt that when he was with this woman, he would feel at ease for some reason. It was just like when he was with the Bao. As for the Sangwon's sister he spoke of, it was the woman who sang when he went to Qin Garden to see Chen Pingping. Chen Pingping liked Sangwon's voice very much. However, Sangwon had to manage Baoyue brothel and expand Fan Xian's grand plan to the entire world. It was impossible for her to stay in Jingdo for long. Thus, Chen Pingping, who loved to enjoy life, could only settle for the next best thing. He brought Sangwon's sister from Yinjing to Jingdo. Sangwon smiled warmly and said, as long as the director likes it. Fan Xian sighed and thought of something else. Because of his appearance, he had already changed countless people's lives. Countless people had gathered at his side because of him. Even Sangwon's sister was no exception. Thinking of these people, how could he bear to quietly leave? However, there were people who could bear to leave. Fan Xian stood in the little courtyard with an unusually ugly expression. The disappointment in his eyes could not be hidden. The well in the courtyard was still there, the stone table was still there, the cotton curtains were still there, and the green shells were still there. However, the people were not there anymore. This was Wang Qinyan's little courtyard. It was hidden deep among the people in the western part of the city. It was not eye-catching. Fan Xian had once eaten many meals in this courtyard, teased old Wang's charming and shy girl, and played with the gourds on the shelves. However, none of this could come back. Wang Qinyan's family had already moved away without a sound. They had even hidden from the Overwatch Council's secret agents Fan Xian had stationed here to protect the Wang family. Wang Qinyan had this ability. Fan Xian never doubted this. From Chen Pingping's mouth, he learned the good news that Wang Qinyan was alive. At the same time, he learned that Wang Qinyan had left. He knew why Chen Pingping had sent Wang Qinyan away. Wang Qinyan had escaped from Dong Mountain. Regardless of whether it was in terms of Qing law or council regulations, he could only die. Fan Xian would not let him die. This was a thorn between him and the emperor. Furthermore, Chen Pingping knew that Wang Qinyan knew too many of Fan Xian's secrets. For Fan Xian's safety, he had to have Wang Qinyan leave. For some reason, the departure of such a subordinate made Fan Xian so sad. He held a letter in his hand. Wang Qinyan had passed it to him through Chen Pingping. There were very few words in the letter. The general gist was that he had abandoned the emperor and left the mountain. This was a capital offense. However, Fan Xian made him feel at ease and did not make the grave mistake he was worried about. Fan Xian's heart was at a loss. He knew that Wang Qinyan had taken the risk to come down the mountain to find him because he was afraid that he would think the emperor was already dead and, with a flip of his hand, embark on the path of fighting for imperial power. His hand tightened slightly and crumpled the paper into a ball. His expression was ugly. There was no one to joke with him anymore. Su Wenmao's level was much lower than Lao Wang's. He lowered his head and looked at Lao Wang's little courtyard. For some reason, he thought of a scene from many years ago. At that time, he had still been a young man who had just entered Jingdo and didn't know any rules. He had dazedly gone to the Qing temple and met his wife. Stupidly, he had gone to the Overwatch Council's square building. He had seen a lifeless face, deathly white teeth, and old skin on both cheeks. It was Wang Qinyan. At that time, Wang Qinian was an official whose spirit had already been worn down by paperwork. He spent all day in the Overwatch Council waiting for the day of his retirement. However, he was the first person Fan Xian had met. From then on, his life changed. He returned to the nervousness and interest of his life as a great bandit. Fan Xian and Wang Qinian's meeting was a kind of fate. It was this kind of coincidental encounter that made Fan Xian trust him incomparably and Wang Qinian incomparably loyal to him. He changed Wang Qinian's life. Wang Qinian knew all of his secrets, including the chest, the key, and his thoughts. Wang Qinian was not only his subordinate, but also his good friend. He was the person he talked to and confided in. Such a role could not be replaced by anyone. It was such a role that, for Fan Xian's own safety and future, he had no choice but to disappear without a trace. Fan Xian's face was slightly pale. He thought to himself, "You should all leave and leave me alone in this place that is not suitable for people." A moment later, he thought it through and bowed toward the little courtyard. His secrets were too terrifying. Perhaps it had made Wang Qinian's life difficult and stressful these years. Perhaps he preferred the muddle-headed days of the past and a life without pressure. He hoped that Wang Qinian's family would be safe in the future. Fan Xian sighed and walked out of the courtyard. Turning his head to look at the silent Mu Feng beside him, he furrowed his brows and said, "Why are you pulling a long face? Your wife has already given birth to a second child. Do you still miss the daughter of Lao Wang's family?" After Wang Qinian left, Fan Xian had to have a personal attendant at his side. The most suitable candidate, Deng Ziyu, was far away in Shangjing in northern Qi, carrying out a difficult mission. Su Wenmao could not be moved in the palace treasury, so there was no other way. Fan Xian could only promote Mu Tai's nephew. After following him for a month, there was no problem with this kid's loyalty, but he was not as interesting as Wang Qinian. It was his unfamiliarity and inconvenience that made Fan Xian understand that Sir Wang Qinian was far from just a sidekick. His abilities were actually all hidden under his smile. Usually, he just didn't see it. Thinking of this, his thoughts became even more faint as water. The rewards that had been delayed for 2 months finally came. Other than the civil officials who had filled in the empty positions at the beginning of the rebellion, the various people who had truly accomplished great service in quelling the rebellion finally received an edict from the palace. Yi Zhong was promoted and rewarded generously. He entered the capital as the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs. However, the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison was given to Xiao Jinhua, the commander of Donghua Gate, who had blocked the crown prince's rebel army inside the city. The original commander of the 13 city guards, Zhang Deqing, was killed by 1,000 cuts after being captured. 3 of his family members were executed. This was the heaviest punishment in the entire rebellion. Fan Xian did not forcefully oppose the emperor on this matter. Although he knew that Zhang Deqing's cousins had nothing to do with this matter, he knew the emperor's anger on the matter of Zhang Deqing. The emperor trusted Zhang Deqing greatly, but Zhang Deqing had betrayed. If he didn't kill a few more, he wouldn't be able to vent the emperor's dark emotions. The great prince still controlled the imperial army. None of the rewards had fallen behind. However, he had already been made Prince Huqing and could not be given any more. Gong Jian had been moved back to the palace and began to take over the affairs of the guards. As for how the future would be arranged, the emperor knew, and Fan Xian could guess. As for Fan Xian's reward, there was a small problem. According to news from the palace, the emperor had been prepared to directly bestow Fan Xian the title of Junwan. However, he had been fearfully blocked by the scholars Hu and Shu. A different surname being made a king had never happened before. No wonder the officials were terrified by the emperor's initial edict. Although everyone knew that Fan Xian was the emperor's illegitimate child, his surname was, after all, Fan. If he suddenly became a king, the Qin kingdom would be laughed at by the world. Fan Xian was also shocked, becoming a king, and the king of Donghua at that. What was this? Fortunately, this edict had been blocked. He was incomparably grateful to the scholars Hu and Shu. First-rank Duke of Donghua was already the limit for non-royal descendants. As for the land and gold, Fan Xian did not care much about it. He was currently one of the wealthiest people in the world. Perhaps the emperor also knew that other rewards would not satisfy Fan Xian, which was why he had made the absurd suggestion of making him a king at the beginning. He could not be made a king. Unexpectedly, the palace finally sent down an edict to bestow the name Fan Shunning on Fan Xian's daughter, Fan Xiaohua, and make her a princess. Preposterous. There were countless preposterous things in the world, but none was more preposterous than this. The daughter of a minister was actually conferred the title of a princess, and this daughter was not even born of the first wife, yet she insisted on using Lin Wan'er's title as a descendant. It was too absurd. No one would have thought that the emperor would have such a stubborn and mischievous side. Of course, in Fan Xian's opinion, the most absurd thing was the name the emperor had given the girl, Shunning. Did you think you were playing around? No matter how absurd this edict was, a glimmer of warmth still rose in Fan Xian's heart. He felt the emperor's intentions. The next day, he entered the palace to see the emperor and give thanks. Along the way, he asked if Shunning's name could be changed. Without waiting for him to open his mouth, the emperor smiled slightly and said, "Jiaozhou's Su Mao Kai. I removed him from his position and let him retire. He has already returned to Chuanzhou." Hearing this, Fan Xian's heart jumped. His mouth was dry. He was so shocked he couldn't say a word. He didn't dare to say anything else. He kowtowed in thanks and silently returned to the manor. He thought deeply for a long time in the manor's study, calculating just what the emperor wanted to do and what he knew. He knew where Su Maokai had given himself away. From Dong Mountain to Danzhou, Su Maokai had helped him resist the Jiaozhou navy, landed on the shore, and broken arrows. It was clear that he was one of his people. Before the Jiaozhou navy was trapped on Dong Mountain, Su Maokai had not sent any news to the court. Although the emperor counted all of this in his heart, he cared deeply about the heart of any official. It was clear that Su Maokai was loyal to Fan Xian and not to the court. After the matter, the emperor only needed to check Su Maocai's history these years to connect it to the once illustrious Chuanzhou navy. If this had been any other time, it would have been difficult for Su Maokai to escape death. Fortunately, Fan Xian had always displayed unwavering loyalty to the emperor, including the Dong Mountain incident. After experiencing countless tests, he had finally obtained the emperor's absolute trust. This time, he did not kill Su Maokai and did not say explicitly. He only said he was letting him retire. This could be considered giving Fan Xian enough face. Fan Xian's heart felt a bit cold. He also felt a bit confused. Once again, he sank into confusion. The next day, he did not enter the palace to ask for forgiveness because he was not guilty. However, he occasionally couldn't help but think that the emperor was much gentler than before. If it had been a crown prince or the second prince, this matter would not have ended as easily as it did today. The gentler the emperor was to him, the more uncomfortable Fan Xian felt. In the palace, the emperor had once asked about the situation of the tyrannical Jinshi in his body. Knowing that there was no danger of his body exploding, he remained silent and did not say a word. Fan Xian could not understand what his true attitude was. Time was like snow. It scattered and gently fell, easily covering everything in the world. When northern Qi, southern Qing, and western Hu were all covered in snow, the sound of firecrackers gradually rang out. Fragrance filled the air. It was the arrival of the spring festival. The 8th year of the Qing calendar had finally arrived. During the time of internal chaos in the Qing kingdom, regardless of whether it was the Empress Dowager, who had been in power for a few days, or the emperor, who had returned to the capital, they all resolutely used the powerful military forces in their hands to attack in all directions. They used such an overbearing momentum to intimidate everyone in the world. In the west, Li Hongsheng was following the Western Expedition Army and coldly watching the movements of the Hu people in the wind and snow. After the Hu people's power gathered the elite of the northern man, they had become more and more powerful. However, the snow-covered plains made everyone resist the harsh nature. No one was in the mood to fight. They had to wait until the first spring grass grew and the Hu people's horses gained their first layer of fat before the Hu people would once again come to Shilyang Road in the Qing Kingdom to carry out the routine that had lasted for 100 years. The entertainment that had been banned in Jingdo for a month because of the Empress Dowager's death was finally lifted. Perhaps it was to show that the Qing Kingdom was still singing and dancing, but the emperor continuously issued a number of benevolent edicts. Dances danced, horses galloped, firecrackers rang, red lanterns hung high, and Jingdo was a fiery red. On the first day of a new year, Fan Xian was brought to the palace by the emperor. He ate a meal and missed the important event of the Fan clan. After another 2 days, Fan Xian finally escaped and brought his entire family to a place on the outskirts of Jingdo. This place was completely different from the festive atmosphere of the new year. It was shrouded in an oppressive, sorrowful, and gloomy atmosphere. This was a cemetery, a new cemetery. The emperor did not allow the bodies of the people who participated in the rebellion to be taken away by wild dogs. Instead, he gathered them together and buried them in one place. He also did not restrict relatives from coming to pay their respects. This edict touched countless people. A few tombs of clearly different styles and sizes were on the hill. Fan Xian held his daughter with Lin, Wan and Cece behind him. He stood in front of these tombs and turned his head to look at the wisps of green smoke rising from the cemetery below. He was silent. Before they came here, they had already gone to another tomb to pay their respects to the subordinates of the Overwatch Council and imperial soldiers who had died in the Jingdo Rebellion. Fan Xian did not go to the royal mausoleum, although the Empress Dowager was buried there. He came directly to this side and came to the top of this hill. Pulling back his gaze from below, he looked at these large tombs silently. The crown prince, the second prince, the empress, and the eldest princess were all buried here. No matter how benevolent the emperor had become, he would not allow these people to be buried in the royal cemetery. However, this place was facing the water and mountains. It was also a place with good feng shui. Additionally, it was far from the green smoke below, so it could be considered quiet. Putting down the joss paper and incense he had bought, Fan Xian stood in front of the 4 large tombs and bowed. He then followed Lin Wan to kneel in front of the eldest princess' grave and kowtowed twice. He then held little Hua to show to the people in the grave. In order to ward off evil, he rubbed some wine between little Hua's brows. The spiciness made the little girl cry. Fan Xian raised his brows and looked at the stone tomb in front of him. He thought to himself, "My mother-in-law, please don't let little Hua be as strange as you." Seeing that Wan was still kneeling on the ground, burning joss paper, Fan Xian did not disturb her. Instead, he walked in front of the crown prince, Li Changxian, and the second prince's graves. Looking at the 2 graves, he couldn't help but quietly recite, "Even if there is a 1,000-year iron threshold, in the end, it is still a dirt bun." There were 4 large and hard dirt buns there. Fan Xian looked at them in a daze. His emotions were complicated. It was not until now that he realized that the blood of the Li family not only flowed with madness and perversion, it was also brimming with pride and unyieldingness. He looked at Li Chengxian and the second prince's graves and sighed in his heart. The Li brothers were truly unyielding, much stronger than him. No one knew better than Fan Xian how terrifying death was. However, these 2 Li brothers had died so cleanly and with such pride. They used this kind of death to shatter the emperor's hard outer shell. In this, he was not as good as them. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought to himself. Holding to Bao's hand behind him, he walked back to the eldest princess's grave. Looking at Wan's tearful eyes, Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then pitifully crouched down and wiped the corners of her eyes. Bao also followed his actions and crouched down, looking at the large grave innocently. Although he didn't know that the most beautiful woman in the Qing kingdom inside the grave had gradually become white bones, he still felt a glimmer of coldness. "The princess mother is inside and not coming out?" Bao asked curiously. "Yes," Fan Xian said with a forced smile. "Xiao Xian, I still feel, why would the princess mother kill Bao?" She was so beautiful. Linda Bao furrowed his brows and asked in a very serious voice. Fan Xian's heart thumped. Realizing that Wan'er did not hear this, he relaxed slightly. A person called Li Yunrui killed Air Bao. This was what Fan Xian had been trying to tell the Bao. Unexpectedly, it couldn't even fool an idiot. He felt a bit bitter in his heart. However, he was unable to explain to the Bao whether a person was beautiful or not was often not the same as what she did. For example, his princess mother and his. Xiao Xianxian. The great prince suddenly appeared behind Fan Xian and the others. The third prince went forward and respectfully bowed to Fan Xian. He then affectionately stood by the Bao's side. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at the great prince. Why have you also come? After all, the identities of the people buried in the 4 mud bonds were too special. Coming to pay respects was too sensitive. The great prince glanced at him with a cold expression and said, The people buried here are also my brothers. Fan Xian was speechless and said with slight worry, I'm just afraid that the emperor will not be happy. The great prince was suddenly silent. A moment later, he quietly said, Father has also come. Fan Xian was startled and abruptly stood up. Turning his head, he gazed toward a certain spot on the hill. He saw that in the chilly winter forest, there was a figure moving about. A middle-aged man wearing bright yellow clothing was looking at the 4 large graves on this side. Although there were countless guards in front and behind him, he looked very lonely. That night, Fan Xian held a banquet in the manor. Yesterday, his father had already resigned and left for Danzhou. Lady Lu had also followed. Presently, only Fan Xian and his family were left in the Fan Manor. It appeared particularly lonely. The banquet Fan Xian held was hot pot. He drank Wuliangye produced by the palace treasury. The guests he had invited were the great prince and third prince. When the hot pot was placed in front of him, Fan Xian seemed to finally understand why he could not forget it since Jiangnan. His heart was empty, and he could not find a clue to his thirst. It was spicy. After eating a mouthful of hot pot, it was so spicy that his head was covered in sweat. It was good. He drank a mouthful of strong wine. It was so painful that his throat was dry. The remaining wine in the pot was gone. The great prince was drunk and lying on the table. No one knew what he was talking about. The third prince was also given 2 cups by Fan Xian. He went to the guest room and lay down drunk. There was only Fan Xian left. Under the cold moon of the winter night, his hand held the wine cup. His eyes were blurry. The spiciness was unbearable, and the pleasure was unbearable. It was as if tears were about to fall. She sat alone on the roof behind him, facing the bright moon and listening to Fan Xian's drunken poem. She was silent. It seemed that even the black cloth covering her eyes was thinking about who she was. Why did he feel something that he had never felt before when he listened to this song? Fishing terrace, wild gull guess for 10 years. White clouds come and go, and green mountains remain. Drink to your heart's content. He owed Yi Zhou for his talents, violated Lu Ruan's prohibition on drinking, and repaid Li Du's poetry debt. Su Zhai laughed at me, and I laughed at Su Zhai. Returning in the evening, the wild apes on West Lake Mountain mourned. 20 years. How many romantic freaks, flowers blooming and withering, on the cloud-gazing platform. The sleeves of the stars to pacify the country broke the Yingyue bewitching stronghold. Su Zhai laughed at me, and I laughed at Su Zhai. It was for the joy in front of the palace. Chapter 594. The battle for third place is too urgent. I'm only a few dozen votes away, and I could be overtaken at any time. If anyone still has a monthly vote, please vote. Just at the VIP monthly voting section of the book page. Please, today is the last day of August, and also the last chapter of Pleasure Before the Palace. The end of this volume, just like the chapter on Ancient Path, is the chapter I'm most satisfied with. After that, it will be the beginning of the next volume, and the beginning of the last volume. This month is the month after the new book month. I've written the most, and everyone can see that it's the most exhausting month I've written. At the same time, I think it's the best month I've written. Just like what Mo Wu said in his book, the things you write must be worthy of yourself and everyone else. For the story of a year of Qingyu, I can be worthy of myself, and I think I can be worthy of all the readers who have subscribed and voted for it. This is the reason why I sincerely ask for monthly votes. Chapter 595, End of Volume 6, Summary and Some Words. Please read it for free. First, I want to express my gratitude to everyone for using the votes in your hands to kick me to third place. This is the most intense month since the start of the new book month. I've been in the top 3 before, but not as nervous and excited as I was yesterday. Perhaps only when people start to want something will they start to value a certain goal. I let out a long sigh. I reached my goal last month completely because of everyone's support. I'm really grateful. 7,949 votes. That was a record in the year of Qingyu. It was doubled in May, but it was still only around 8,000 votes. It was really difficult for me to imagine that I would be able to get so many votes. Perhaps it was because I was getting votes more frequently and being more shameless. Perhaps my frequent canvassing for votes would make some of my dear readers feel a little unhappy. I apologize in advance, but it can't be helped. In Jianghu, people can't help themselves. Just like the little girl on the bridge, she stretched out her hand out of habit. Handsome, buy your girlfriend a flower. Everyone is handsome, so I have to reach out my hand for votes. I have to admit, the ranking on the monthly votes is related to the prize money, but not only is it related to the prize money. There is also a sense of satisfaction and vanity from being recognized, and I am indeed very vain. This is not an excuse. Speed and passion are like this. A fat man can only burn fat, but not the universe. I can only say my thanks again and promise to write more seriously in the future. After saying my thanks, I got to the main topic of the day. After solving the 3rd volume, I have to write an epilogue for every volume. It can be considered a summary and chat with everyone about the content of the volume. This was announced to everyone the day before yesterday, so please take some time to read it. Volume 6 is the longest volume, with a total of almost 1,000,000 words. It can really be described as vast and endless, long-winded, like the eldest princess foot binding. It was clear that the 6th volume was the most important volume of the Qingyu year, because in this volume, all the traps buried in the previous volumes had been stripped of their disguises, and all the power they had accumulated exploded. The people hidden in the dark had all jumped to the front of the stage, and those who were alive or playing minor roles had all died. In the first chapter, before Wu Zhou's son-in-law, when I finished the 2 songs, I was very excited. I wanted to shout, "Something big is going to happen." There were at least tens of thousands of people who had died in this scroll. If only those with names were counted, there were still quite a few. It was truly a tragic scene. Ever since I started writing, I had never written about so many deaths. In the Vermilion Bird Chronicles, Tianqing's massacre of the heavenly soldiers always gave people the impression that he was waving light dots around. Of course, that didn't count. Many people had died, and we had to arrange different ways of death for them. We had to make sure that their deaths matched their personalities. It was a very painful thing, and I was very tired from writing. Particularly for the commoners who had died unjustly, they could not be easily explained away. Dead people also needed to be respected, particularly people like Ku He and the eldest princess. As for the ingenuity and pitfalls, it was not tiring to fill them in, because this was the content that had already been prepared when the 1st volume of the Qingyu year began. Speaking up to this point, I would like to explain a little. This is because a small number of readers think that the emperor transforming into a grandmaster is a cheat, and that the transformation is too sudden. There are even more unkind comments that say that I am too lazy to write an outline, so I write whatever I want, and when I see that things can't be solved, I let the emperor transform into a human. I scratch my head. No, I really did write an outline, and I wrote a detailed outline, Perhaps there was a problem with my ability, but there was no problem with my attitude in writing the Qingyu year. I carefully thought through each step before I continued. It was just like the emperor's true nature, the arrangements of these few years, and even a dozen years. In reality, before the riddle was revealed at Dong Mountain, Even as early as half a year ago, there were already readers who had guessed that the emperor was a great grandmaster. They had basically caught all of the threads I had hidden. It was a happy thing for a storyteller to hide something in the story and then be caught by a friend who was reading the book. For example, the Qing emperor's discovery of Lin Wanner's movements in the Qing temple before Gongyan. For example, after a night of poetry, Wu Zhu and Fan Xian entered the palace. For example, the emperor's strange behavior in the royal study. For example, the source of his powerful confidence. For example, the play in the Hanging Temple. For example, how he knew of the eldest princess and the crown prince's secret, and thus proved Fan Xian and Ping Ping's evil plan. I was very satisfied that, regardless of whether it was the Qing emperor or Yi Luyuan, these two biggest traps, they had already pointed out what they were hiding the first time they appeared. The Qing emperor's first appearance was in the Qing temple. Yi Luyuan's first appearance was in Danzhou, and he saw Wu Zhu. The world was so big. Why did he go to Danzhou? It had been a long time since I had been narcissistic. Today, I will be a little narcissistic. I was very satisfied with these two threads leading to the end. As for the Qing emperor's identity as a great grandmaster, the deepest hidden thread was mentioned in Chen Pingping and Fan Jian's last conversation. During the northern expedition, the Qing emperor was heavily injured. His entire body was stiff and unable to move. I have mentioned this story many times before. The more important ones were in Volume 4, Chapter 28, and Volume 5, Chapter 50, Autumn Forest Whispers. At the time, Chen Pingping faintly said to Fan Xian, at the time the emperor was injured. His body was as hard as a block of wood. He could not move at all. As for the matters of wiping his body and urinating and defecating, there had to be a careful woman left to do it. Later, on a stormy night, the eldest princess also mentioned her brother's heavy injury. His entire body was stiff. What did that look like? It was actually the exact same situation after Fan Xian's tyrannical Jinqi reached its peak and exploded. During that northern expedition, the emperor, who had already trained his tyrannical Jinqi to the peak, fought a bloody battle and spat out Jinqi wildly. Just like the battle between Fan Xian and the Shadow, he finally exploded. Furthermore, he exploded even more fiercely than Fan Xian. He did not have two circulations like Fan Xian or Fan Xian's monstrously thick meridians. His luck was even worse than Fan Xian's. In the barren mountains and unruly rivers, there was no doctor, no medicine, no waste, and no begonia. There was only Qin Pingping and Lady Ning. Thus, the Qing emperor's meridians were shattered. He could not move at all. He bled internally and almost died. However, in the end, he survived. Without great perseverance and great luck, one could not reach the realm of a great grandmaster. When it came to perseverance, without question, the Qing kingdom's mighty emperor fully deserved to be number one. No one could compare to him. As for the story of that northern expedition, how the emperor entered the realm of a great grandmaster, and the effect this experience had on him, there will be a more detailed description in the next volume, Emperor of the Dynasty. I will not continue here. Since we're talking about the Qing emperor, I will say a few more words. Perhaps from the beginning, I knew what kind of ruthless character I was writing about, so I have always secretly invested my feelings in him. Even now, I still think this emperor is very remarkable. When a person is cold-blooded and heartless, or a bastard, you have to admit that this is another form of greatness. Furthermore, we always stand in Fan Xian's or Yi Qingmei's point of view to consider problems. Sometimes, perhaps we forget that the Qing emperor also made many sacrifices for the sake of a goal. In other words, he was also an idealist. Among the people of that generation, there were three idealists. One was Yi Qingmei, the other was the emperor, and the son of the two of them was a true realist. He was a little merciful, a little lenient, a little scheming, a small citizen, a villager, and a cynic. Of course, this is what I like about Fan Xian. After all, he is still like a person, while his parents are not like people anymore. Book friends often say that there are two lines in the Qingyu years, one in the light and one in the dark. One is about Fan Xian, and one is about Yi Qingmei. In reality, when I write, there are basically 3 lines. There's still one line that I've always kept in mind, and that is the Emperor. From this, it can be seen how much I value and admire this person. Admiration does not mean that I like him. My sisters, please understand this and promise me. When a woman reaches the pinnacle, she is Yi Qingmei. When a man reaches the pinnacle, he is the Qing Emperor. These are just some of my personal thoughts. They are not necessarily correct. Furthermore, I have always thought that when things are too extreme, they're always very cruel to others and to oneself. Fancian is so good, so mediocre. So right now, he is so troublesome and difficult to endure. Things like feelings are always obtained through interaction. There are no innate feelings. For example, his feelings for Fan Jian and his feelings for Chen Pingping. Just as Gidge Pig said, in front of the cave in Xi Mountain in northern Xi, Fancian mainly thought of Yi Qingmei as a distant and unreachable kindred, a friend connected by blood and heart, close but unfamiliar. However, her legacy lived on. Every breath of air carried the scent of that woman. Everyone beside him would retell the story of the past. Gradually, Fancian finally determined his own nature. He was already in the Qing kingdom. He was a part of this world. Yi Qingmei was his mother. This was the process of brainwashing. Fancian kept his distance from the emperor, but he had to admit that the emperor treated him well. Knowing favors was a good moral character. He could only blame himself, an orphan, for having such a pair of parents after his rebirth. But Fancian had also improved, a great improvement. It was an improvement in his worldview. This was a very remarkable thing. In terms of age, he was already a middle-aged man, yet he was still able to continuously revise his ideals. Particularly, his ideals had been washed away by death and appeared incomparably stubborn and ruthless. In the meadow, he stood up. In life, he should also stand up. He should gradually understand that life will always end. Some existences in life may be more important than life itself. Many people died in this volume. It is truly a sad thing, but I won't write anything to mourn those pitiful people because it is already written in the book. A few days ago, I saw a blog. The girl who wrote the blog, it should be a girl, right? Wrote a long review after Dong Mountain. At the time, I remembered it. Later, I saw people transfer it in the book review section. Thank you very much. In a moment, I will move it to the public area for everyone to take a look. I sighed again. Writing this volume was very tiring, particularly the last dozens of chapters. It was truly beyond my expectations that I had written so many words in August. Sometimes, I found that some sour words were right. After writing for a long time, it was no longer me who controlled the story, but the story that controlled me. The people in the story had their own thoughts and were not controlled by me at all. Then, they had the desire to act and speak, and they used my hand to beat it out. That is why I wrote so quickly last month. It was because of this that I couldn't resist writing one paragraph after another. Perhaps it was because I had feeling for the characters in the story. Fancian had stayed in that world for a long time, so he had love. I had written about this world for a long time, so I also had love. Regardless of whether it was Vermilion Bird's story or Qing Yunyan, the latter parts were better written than the former. For the work of the 7th volume, I had taken the time these 2 days to read Qing Yunyan in detail from beginning to end and once again confirm this point. It wasn't because I didn't put in effort at the beginning. It was because the characters at the beginning were all unfamiliar and distant to me. After writing 2 million words, I was already very familiar with these people's faces. Like the little girl selling noodles downstairs, I was happy and naturally familiar with them. The level of the later parts was better, but the level of the words did not improve. Especially after rereading, I found many wordy places, sticky places, and redundant words. This was a very shameful thing. My words were sloppy, but they were never clean. The cleanest words in Qing Yunyan still appeared in the chapter where Fan Xian killed the assassin when he was 12. The problem was that I had written that chapter for 4 whole hours, and the number of words was still very small. For the time being, I can't solve the problems with the words. Please forgive me. However, I still like the chapter names I chose. Every afternoon, after writing a few thousand words, I would worry about what to name it. Basically, it was all nonsense, but sometimes it was quite interesting. In the last 10 or so chapters, many readers pointed out that there were many famous foreign names. Some friends even asked in the book review section if I had been studying the history of foreign literature. Actually, what you said was right. The process of writing Vermilion Bird Story was a learning process. Until the end, I was still full of energy and my mind was full. Writing Qin Yunyan was a digging process. My mind was almost empty, so I decided to read. I wanted to read the world's famous books to fill my empty mind. Unfortunately, I still didn't manage to read a single book. I only sadly remembered many of the titles I found, such as The Grapes of Wrath, Father and Son, The Winter of Our Discontent, 100 Years of Solitude, and The Catcher in the Rye Field. Hey, you don't say. The names of these famous books really match the contents of the chapters. What a coincidence! It seemed my luck was similar to Fan Xian's. Although I couldn't read famous books to improve myself, stealing so many names helped. If I wasn't reading famous books, what was I reading? Of course, novels from Qidian. I read a lot of novels. You can see on the rankings, I basically read them because I like to read. This was the starting point of my writing. Yes, it was time for the book recommendation at the end of each paper. Of course, I won't talk about the old books because everyone on Earth knows about them. I'll just talk about the books I liked in the past few days. The first book is called The Ordinary Life. This is my favorite in the past half a year. Warning, it's a book for girls. Don't read it unless you like it. But I want to strongly recommend it to everyone. It's not just light, not just the irrepressible mockery at the beginning, not just the detailed descriptions. The key is the portrayal of the characters, the fluency of the writing, and the most alluring fantasies at the bottom of the words. Shunning is the most suitable character to be a daughter. That's why Fan Xian named his daughter Shunning, because I hoped that Xiaohua would be like Shunning. Wan Ning is the best character I've described in the books I've read in Qidian. Who does she resemble? Like Dingya, Li Shiming, Shi Xiongzi, Li Xioning, these seniors in the long river of history. In Qidian novels, there are very few characters that make you like. I can't say it, but it's good. And I always thought that the boy that the author wanted to make fun of at the beginning didn't die. That's what I firmly believe. My friend especially insists that Shunning is the best match for CC, and he wanted to make a lot of noise. But I think that unless this CC isn't the CC, then we should just forget about it. Coincidentally, the second book I recommend is my friend especially Bai's new book. He's written about Shaolin monks and evil Ming. Now he's writing about the Fist Qi. He always goes the hard route, and it makes people like me feel a bit of pain. I want to read about love and ambiguity, these urban things, but he wants men to go to this extent. The Fist Qi should be published today. This story is really hard. If everyone wants to read something straightforward, then read this book and train your spirit. The third book I recommend is Chaotic Clouds, student Chui Hua's new work. The quality is guaranteed. Chui Hua is Ning Chuiya. The guy is finally back. Yes, of course, this book has very few words. If I recommend it, it will certainly attract discussion. But I have to admit that I've been reading this book since the beginning. I've been reading it all the way until the end of his draft. Of course, the draft is more than just the words posted now. If I remember correctly, Chaotic Clouds should have been written more than half a year ago. In the end, it took so long for it to be posted. Xiao Chui put in a lot of effort. She put in so much effort that it took her a lot of effort to write. It was truly admirable. I need to read it carefully. After talking about the 6th volume and recommending books, I will talk about the 7th volume, which is the final volume of the Qing dynasty. This volume is very troublesome, very troublesome. I will try to finish it before the end of the year and draw a satisfactory, full stop. I don't need to worry about a bad ending, because cats care about their tails the most. Cat owners all know this. The 7th volume, Emperor of the Qing dynasty, has 3 periods. Of course, it is still the traditional way. It is impossible to suddenly and inexplicably start. However, there are some things that started in the 8th year of the Qing calendar that I cannot talk about specifically. Everyone, please follow me as I unfold it. The joy in front of the palace is not joyous. As for Emperor of the Qing dynasty, perhaps it looks a bit depressed, but I want to twist it into a bright youth. Everyone, Look at how happy I'm writing this summary. You will know what kind of emotions I am cultivating. However, because the seventh volume is too troublesome, I need time to organize my thoughts and outline. I asked for a day off from everyone so that my mind, which was empty because of the end of the sixth volume, can be taught again. Today, other than this summary, there is no main text. I asked for everyone's understanding. However, I have written over 5,000 words in the summary. I really am as long-winded as ever. It is very strange that I did not update on the first day of the month, but I cannot help but urge everyone to vote for me. It is said that it is easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. It is difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. It is difficult to go from the vast ocean to the water. Apart from Mount Wu, it is not clouds. Taking a flower bush, I am lazy to look back. Half fate, the monthly vote, and half fate, I raise my cup to invite the bright moon. I did not want to be scolded, so I quickly stopped being sour. Finally, I congratulate teacher Wang Haidong for having children. Mother and daughter are safe. As a mother, her stomach was stabbed, but as a father, his feet hurt. This is a small matter. Haha, I congratulate him again. Yes, it is about the same time as Fan Xian's father. Chapter 596. A dream of glory and splendor. Half a piece of scholarly papers. 1,000 feet of sea waves. Horse hooves shatter the frost of the forbidden street. Listening to the rooster sing several times. Dust and clothing, the heart of the Jianghu. Out of the royal phoenix net, Muichi Shouyang, sighing that Han Peng did not end. Early in the paper, the demonic form. Yuan Wang, Yuan Heng, the emperor of the court, as the inscription. The clouds in the sky were like wet cotton, ready to squeeze out water at any moment. They were also like large lead ingots, heavy and not something the air could hold. They were probably going to smash into the world in the next moment. Rain was already trickling down from the leaden clouds and dripping to the ground. No one knew when it would become a torrential rain. Song Shiren, once the best litigation master in Jingdo and nicknamed Rich Mouth, now had white hair at his temples. His features were no longer as free and at ease as before. He was much more steady. He gazed calmly at the sky. No one knew what he was thinking. A moment later, he pulled back his gaze and sat in a chair, feeling a bit tired. Beside him, someone had brought him hot tea. He took a sip and rinsed his mouth. He then accepted a scalding hot towel and pressed it against his eyes. Only then did he feel more energetic. There were also people behind him massaging his back and legs. There were also people who began to fan him. However, the autumn of the 9th year of the Qing calendar was already cold. Additionally, the autumn rain was about to arrive. Jingdo was completely cold. How could he stand the fan? Song Shiren couldn't help but shiver. The person beside him in black official robes glared at the subordinate holding the fan. This Overwatch Council official was the head of the First Bureau, Mu Tai. He looked carefully at Song Shiren and said, "Sir Song, are you confident?" Although Song Shiren had heard this title for a year and a half, he was still not used to it. His brows furrowed, and he calmly replied, "Don't worry, sir." This litigation master's first official appearance was in the 4th year of the Qing calendar on behalf of Minister Guo's family. He sued the son of the assistant minister, Song Shiren, for fighting underground in the middle of the night. That case was also a rare complete defeat for Song Shiren. However, he truly caused a stir in the Qing court because of the property dispute lawsuit involving the Jiangnan Ming family in the 6th year of the Qing calendar. In that case, relying on the Overwatch Council Commissioner Fan Xian's strong support, Song Shiren spent half a year in the Suzhou government. He demonstrated everything he had learned in his life to the fullest. He forcefully grasped the loopholes in the Qing law and Ministry of Justice's rules and completely defeated the natural inheritance right of the legitimate eldest that was deeply imprinted in the hearts of the people. This Ming family property dispute lawsuit was truly in Jiangnan, aimed at the Jingdo royal palace. It had to be said, later, the emperor's worship to the heavens to depose the crown prince, as well as the crown prince's final forced rebellion, all had an unclear connection to this lawsuit. In Jiangnan, Song Shuren's glory was limitless. However, when he returned to Jingdou, the crown prince had not been deposed, and the Empress Dowager was furious. The old woman had only quietly said a few words, and the world's best attorney had been kneaded into an ant by the palace. His family's property had been confiscated, and he had to see the world look down on him. He set up a stall in Lotus Pond Square and struggled to survive. Fortunately, Fan Xian returned to the capital at that time and secretly sent him out of Jingdou. He also gifted him a large sum of money as a form of repayment. At the beginning of the 8th year of the Qin calendar, the Jingdou matter was settled. Fan Xian brought Song Shuren's family back and bought him a manor in the west of the city. At the same time, he gave him the identity of an official. Although the best attorney in the world could earn money, his status was not as high as an official's. Song Shuren was endlessly grateful. At the same time, he knew he had to sell his life well for Sir Fan Jr. Additionally, after experiencing the baptism of these few years, Song Shuren was no longer as arrogant as before. Instead, he appeared steady and ordinary, but he still had a powerful ability to execute laws. His present identity was an official of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council's legal department. He was responsible for helping the Overwatch Council fight lawsuits. The Overwatch Council also needed to fight lawsuits. If this matter had to be told from the beginning, it would be a very long story. There were two important points. First, a few years ago, the Emperor had taken back all of the Overwatch Council's trial power and divided it between the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court. Thus, the Overwatch Council was now more of a public prosecutor. During these 2 years, the little Duke of the Overwatch Council seemed to have been provoked by something. After asking for the Emperor's edict, he began to purge the governance of officials. The Overwatch Council had captured countless corrupt officials in various roads, counties, and departments. If they captured a criminal official, they had to be interrogated. If they were just handed over to the Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court to interrogate, the Overwatch Council would not be satisfied. Sir Fan Jr. would also not agree. Everyone knew that officials protected each other. Since the Overwatch Council wanted to investigate the governance of officials, they would not give these civil officials a chance to band together. Thus, Song Shuren, the newly promoted official of the Overwatch Council specializing in lawsuits, played a great role. As long as he appeared, the crimes the Overwatch Council pinned down were basically all brought to fruition. No matter how the court's civil official system tried to hide it, they were unable to let the criminal officials escape. What truly chilled the Overwatch Council were the Emperor's edicts after the Jingdou matter was settled. Although these edicts only continued the plans set when the 7 gentlemen entered the palace and had the Imperial Censorate enter the Council's internal procedures to carry out supervision, the Imperial Censor of the left, his own way, relied on the Emperor's favor and clear edicts to truly use his power. On one hand, he weakened the Overwatch Council's power. On the other hand, he began to attack some of the Overwatch Council's violations of the law. The world was large, but it was not as large as the Emperor's edict. After almost 2 years, the Imperial Censorate's power gradually grew. It was like a rope across the Overwatch Council's neck, making it difficult for the Overwatch Council officials to breathe. His own way was like a hunting dog, standing guard outside the Overwatch Council. As long as an official of the Overwatch Council did something forbidden, he would not be soft-hearted or courteous. He would draft up a rule and send it directly to the Supreme Court to ask the court to punish them. The Overwatch Council didn't have any good ideas. From the beginning of the Overwatch Council's establishment, there had been this rule. The Qin law had strictly restricted them from acting against the Imperial Censorate. However, because of the powerful existences of Chun, Pingping, and Fan Xian, this rule had always been forgotten, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Now that the Emperor had once again remembered this matter, the Imperial Censorate began to shine. Fortunately, Sir Fan Jr. was still the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, so the Imperial Censorate's actions were still relatively gentle. His own way was careful not to touch Fan Xian's bottom line. He only made an issue of the Qin law and didn't bring any insult to the Overwatch Council. However, the Overwatch Council acted in secret and would often violate the Qing law. The Imperial Censorate relied on edicts to urge the Supreme Court to investigate. Even Fan Xian didn't have a good way to deal with it. In the end, this was the Emperor's edict. Furthermore, he knew that the Overwatch Council's dominance was not a good thing for the court. Understanding did not mean accepting. One day in the 8th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian kicked open the main door of the Imperial Censorate. He pointed at the 20 or so Imperial censors under his own way and cursed them angrily. He then invited Song Shuren back. Wasn't it just a lawsuit? Was the Overwatch Council afraid of others? Song Shuren had to fight 2 lawsuits in a row in the Supreme Court. One was that the Overwatch Council had found that a vice director of the Ministry of Works had colluded with the River Transport Governor's Yamen to embezzle silver from the river works. Furthermore, this silver was not from the public. Fan Xian had painstakingly saved it from his own little treasury in the Jiangnan Palace treasury. Then, through the Hangzhou conference that Lady Fan controlled, it had been transported to the River Transport Governor's Yamen. Greed had reached the head of the Overwatch Council's ancestor, so the Overwatch Council was not polite at all. They didn't care about the minister-councilor's connections in court or the private pleading letter the River Transport Governor had sent. In one dark night, they arrested 20 related criminals and locked them up in the 7th Bureau's prison for a few days before sending them to the Supreme Court. The second lawsuit was a bit of a headache. The Imperial Censorate had found that a certain official of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council stationed in Nanzhou had secretly transferred some silver from the Honglu Temple. When this official returned to the capital to report on his work, the problem was discovered. Using the words of this 4th Bureau official at the time, there was not enough funds. In order to develop spies in Nanzhou, they had no choice but to use public funds. However, no one knew exactly how much he had used and whether or not he had intercepted it. The inside of the Overwatch Council knew that this colleague had certainly received benefits. It was just that he was a spy in a foreign country. Even though Commissioner Fan had consecutively increased the Overwatch Council's monthly salary 3 times, they were still nervous. No one was a saint. Has the case been prepared? Song Shuren glanced at the assistant beside him. His name was Chun Buchang. He was the famous person who had fought against Song Shuren in Jiangnan. Unexpectedly, in the end, he had also been half invited and half tied back to Jingdo by Song Shuren. The newly established legal department of the 8th Bureau was all famous litigation masters from various places. Every time he thought of this, Song Shuren, whose heart was as calm as still water, couldn't help but smile bitterly. Sir Fan Jr.'s way of doing things was still as arrogant as ever. It was clear that the Emperor had the Imperial Censorate check and balanced the Overwatch Council, yet you still brazenly went against them and did it so happily. Chun Buchang made a sound of acknowledgement and stood up. As an official of the 1st Bureau of the Overwatch Council, Mu Tai was listening at the side in the Supreme Court. He wanted to see how the Vice-Chancellor of the Ministry of Works was treated and to ensure that the official of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council would not suffer too much. All of the officials of the Overwatch Council admired the 8th Bureau's legal department because they knew that these former litigation masters were the greatest protection for their interests. He patted Song Shuren's shoulder and sincerely said, "Good luck, sir." Outside the Supreme Court, the rain gradually fell lightly. Song Shuren took a sip of tea. His face was full of confidence. With his hands behind his back, he walked toward the Yamen of the Supreme Court. He walked steadily, completely disregarding the Ministry of Justice and Imperial Censorate inside. He walked confidently and confidently. The Jingdo commoners watching the spectacle across the street cheered in unison. They all hoped that the Overwatch Council would be able to chop down all of those corrupt officials. It had to be said that during these 2 years, the Overwatch Council's power had been greatly reduced, but its reputation had improved greatly. Fan Xian had used a few years of time to finally pull the Overwatch Council out of the darkness a little. Using a series of thunderous purges, he had established a glorious image among the people. Presently, the direction of discussion among the people was basically biased toward the Overwatch Council and felt disdain toward the Imperial Censorate. Song Shuren walked toward the Supreme Court. His expression was calm, but his heart was not. Working for Sir Fan Jr. was indeed delightful. Not only was it delightful to win, but he could also receive the support of many people. This was not easy. In over a year, Song Shuren had helped the Overwatch Council fight cases and had never lost. This time, it would certainly be the same. However, he had already completely offended the entire Qing civil official system. He knew that he could no longer get off the Overwatch Council ship. Once he did, he would be swallowed by a giant wave. However, he was not afraid because the person at the helm of the Overwatch Council ship was Sir Fan Jr. As long as Sir Fan Jr. was here, no one in the world would dare to harm him. There are some problems on the Nanzhao side. The Imperial Censorate and Ministry of Justice have taken a large amount of silver from that official's home. Qin Buchang looked at his expression and carefully reminded him. Return the stolen goods. Removed from office. Not guilty. Song Shuren didn't turn his head. Lowering his voice, he said, "This is the Commissioner's bottom line. If the Imperial Censorate wants to go further, they'll have to fight openly. They will start with the Xian tribe. Not many of those people are clean." Qin Buchang's heart chilled. He thought to himself that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed like old Director Chun, a powerful and protective person. Looking at his meaning, if the Imperial Censorate did not accept Fan Jr.'s 3 conditions, Sir Fan Jr. was prepared to mess around. He couldn't help but shiver. With Sir Fan Jr. doing things like this, it was no wonder the Imperial Censorate could never win the case against his family. After all, no matter how much Sir Hezonwei was favored by the Emperor or how much effort he put in, he could not stop Sir Fan Jr. from becoming hostile at any moment. If Sir Fan Jr. truly became hostile, Hezonwei would not be able to withstand it. Given his personality, even if the Emperor spoke, it would probably be useless. Everyone knew how much the Emperor valued or favored him. Why didn't the Commissioner come to watch the show today? Qin Buchang swallowed and asked as he walked. During this year, Fan Xian's greatest interest seemed to be acting as a backer for his subordinates, listening to the Supreme Court's trials, and watching the Imperial Censorate's ashen faces. Logically speaking, it was fine to send an official of Mu Tai's level to listen. Even Yin Bingyun couldn't be bothered to come. Yet he kept coming. This little duke sat with his legs crossed in the Supreme Court Yamen. All of the trial officials began to feel afraid. No one dared to use torture on an Overwatch Council official. This was the effect he wanted. The Emperor has sent him out. Song Shuren only vaguely knew some inside information. He didn't say anything more. Rubbing his wrist, he glanced at the Imperial Censorate and Ministry of Justice officials in the hall. His face darkened. With a cold huff, he began to fight. Heading west from Jingdo, going around the verdant Song Mountain, crossing a number of clear rivers, and, after a dozen more days, entering an area where hundreds of li of military land was being cultivated. This was one of the Qing Kingdom's 7 main roads, Shiliang Road. This road was the poorest place in the Qing Kingdom, but it was also the place with the strangest scenery. Most of the land along this road had been repeatedly fought over by the Central Plain and the Hu people over hundreds of years. Until the Wei Kingdom weakened, the Qing Kingdom and its predecessor, the vassal state, began to rise in secret. This country had not yet advanced into the heart of the land when they began to demand 1,000 years of blood debt and land from the Hu people. After fighting for many years and many people died, this piece of land was finally firmly controlled by the Qing Kingdom. At the same time, they built a number of new cities on it and moved in many people. However, it was, after all, a newly prosperous land. Other than farming, commerce was not developed. There were also no valuable products. It was only in recent years that the fleeing of the people who moved in had improved slightly. There were only flat and rarely tended fields, endless lines on the horizon, and the protruding mounds at the edge of the line. The barren desert in the distance looked desolate. The sun here set later than anywhere else in the land. The blood-red dusk enveloped the vast land and reflected a majestic city. It was completely piled up from earth and stone. It suddenly appeared at the edge of the land, flaunting the Qing Kingdom's powerful national and military power and intimidating the people on the grasslands further west of the majestic city. This was Dingzhou, an important city on the western frontier. The road from Jingdou to Dingzhou was maintained very well. It could accommodate 8 horses traveling side by side. Back then, who knew how much manpower and wealth had been expended? However, it ensured the eternal peace of the Qing kingdom's west and firmly controlled this large piece of land. No matter how one looked at it, it was worth it. A group of carriages sped toward Dingzhou on this road. It seemed that they wanted to enter Dingzhou before the sun set. However, looking at the mountain in front of them ran the horse to death, particularly on this piece of flat land. Dingzhou seemed to be in front of them, but was far away on the horizon. It looked like they would not be able to enter the city before the city gates closed. About 20 li from Dingzhou was a courier station. This courier station was not a military courier station. It was not under the jurisdiction of the Dingzhou army. Rather, it was a courier station managed by the Ministry of Works. Thus, it appeared a bit run down and old. 7 or 8 men were yawning under the light of the setting sun. They had already eaten dinner and were preparing to gamble later. The sky gradually darkened. A strange smile suddenly appeared on the men's faces. They moved closer to the rear courtyard and listened to the sounds coming from inside. They covered their mouths and laughed, thinking that the person inside was too impatient. In a stone room in the backyard, the only official of the relay station was hugging a woman's snow-white thighs. His hands were pressed against her soft breasts, and he was moaning nonstop. His body was covered in sweat, and the room was filled with the smell of lust. Dingzhou was far away and did not have much entertainment. Night came too late. Thus, each time the sun set, he would seize the moment and carry out this only form of entertainment. The woman beneath him was a prostitute he had brought from Dingzhou. Although the prostitutes who were willing to leave the city were all average in appearance, he liked this woman's charm and the soft flesh on her body. Holding the slippery courier in his hand, he was incomparably happy. He felt that the woman beneath him seemed to be made of cotton candy, particularly her eyes, which were sweeter and more greasy than the well water in Dingzhou. The 3 liang of silver he earned a month was truly worth it. Just as he was enjoying himself, the door to the room was suddenly pushed open. The courier didn't even turn his head as he cursed. If you want to listen, then listen. If you want to see, then look. F***CK. Why didn't you tell me to be careful? How dare you barge into the door? Be careful not to make me sick on horseback. The prostitute beneath him also giggled. She was not at all afraid of being seen. Suddenly, the courier felt that something was strange because there was no sound behind him for a long time. He unconsciously turned his head and saw it was a stranger. Startled, he quickly jumped up from the Kong and fastened his pants. He did not forget to pull over the black quilt and cover the prostitute's white lower body on the Kong. The courier wanted to let loose a torrent of curses, but seeing this stranger's expensive attire, he was probably someone he couldn't afford to offend or an official. His mouth became dry, and he became afraid. In a trembling voice, he said, "Who are you?" Fan Xian sat in the only chair in the courier station and looked at the large group of people kneeling in front of him. Furrowing his brows, he said, "I told you to get up, so get up quickly." He had come to Dingzhou on the emperor's edict to reward the army. He said it was to reward the army, but the secret edict he had received in the royal study had some other content. During these 2 years, the Hu people in the West seemed to have taken some stimulant or tranquilizer. They changed their romantic battle tactics of the past and began to attack Dingzhou in an organized fashion. Furthermore, their battle tactics had become very cunning. Although the Yi family still managed Dingzhou's military affairs, Yi Zhong was in charge of the Bureau of Military Affairs. He had to manage all the armies under heaven, so he could not personally keep watch. Additionally, the Hu people's attacks were too fierce. In the first year, the situation in Dingzhou was very dangerous. Fortunately, the emperor personally moved the soldiers from the various roads to take turns to provide support. Only then did the situation stabilize. The emperor and Fan Xian had long seen that there were problems, but without first-hand information, no one knew what was happening within the Hu people. The situation could not continue like this. If Xiu continued to develop like this, it would probably become a great threat to the Qing kingdom. Thus, Fan Xian had made this trip. He had to listen to the personal reports from the generals in Dingzhou and understand the situation. Furthermore, Fan Xian knew that the emperor had personally moved the 5 roads to the west with the intention of using the Hu people's knives to sharpen the Qin kingdom's swords. The Hu people's attack just happened to give the Qin kingdom a chance to train its military power and prepare for the war to unify the world in the future. Since he couldn't make it to Dingzhou, he could only rest for the night in this dilapidated relay station. Unexpectedly, no one came to welcome him when he entered. 7 or 8 men were eavesdropping like children. Fan Xian was curious and pushed open the door to enter. Unexpectedly, he saw a live, erotic scene. The deputy and the 7 or 8 men knelt on the ground and repeatedly kowtowed. The officials who had come with Fan Xian knew his personality and had long pretended to see it. They each prepared to rest for the night. Fan Xian looked at the deputy and laughingly scolded. "The sun hasn't even set and you're already doing it. If you have the guts, then don't be afraid." The deputy's face fell. He knew he was about to be killed. The man in front of him was the second most important person in the world, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. He was a high and lofty figure. He was someone he didn't even have the right to see. Fan Xian asked with confusion, "What are you afraid of?" "Sir abhors evil and hates corrupt officials the most." The deputy was so scared he was about to cry. Paralyzed on the ground, he spoke of the people's impression of Fan Xian. Fan Xian rubbed the back of his head in confusion. He thought to himself that he was already the father of 2 children. Why was it that in the hearts of the people, he seemed more and more like an otherworldly saint or demon? Chapter 597. The sky was still beginning to brighten when a group of people from Jingdo rose and washed up. This time, Fan Xian had brought all of the council's people, other than Mu Feng, who was now in charge of the Qinian unit's matters. The rest of the people were made up of members of the 2nd and 6th bureaus. The semi-military management of the Overwatch Council made these people's auras steady and taciturn. There was only the sound of water and the creaking of the door opening, but there was no conversation. It was nearly 20 li from the courier station to Dingzhou. Speeding along the 8-horse wide road, it didn't take much time. Furthermore, they didn't need to cherish the horses. When this group of people arrived at the east gate of Dingzhou, the sun had not risen very high. There was a glimmer of coldness in the warmth. However, the vegetable farmers lining up to enter the city, as well as the merchant groups from the Central Plains, had already formed a long line. Autumn had not yet deepened in Jingdo, but the soldiers of the large city on the border had already begun to put on armor padded with layers of cotton. Fan Xian glanced at them inconspicuously and then indicated for Mu Feng, to prepare the documents for customs. From the beginning of his trip to Dingzhou, Fan Xian had not prepared to reveal the imperial envoy's honor guard. Of course, there were only a dozen people. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't. This group of people disguised themselves as Jiangnan merchants. In their hands, they held travel passes and tea contracts issued by the Ministry of Revenue and the Palace Treasury Transport Company. The reason they had to disguise themselves like this was not because the court had any suspicions about the inside of Dingzhou. Rather, it was because Fan Xian wanted to meet someone in private. In order to ensure that person's safety, it was best not to go through the court's channels and meet in private. After all, the Hu people had suddenly become enlightened. The emperor and Fan Xian both suspected that there was a capable person in charge in Shihu. Who knew if there were spies planted by the Hu people in the military and political manners of Dingzhou? The soldiers at the east gate did their inspection work very meticulously. Fan Xian did not line up. He stood to the side of the line and watched with cold eyes. He quietly nodded his head. The Yi family had operated on the western frontier for decades, yet they had not slacked off at all. No wonder the emperor appreciated them so much. The deputy at the courier station wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and followed behind Fan Xian. His heart was pounding. He had also changed into merchant clothing. His face had been tampered with by the Overwatch Council officials, making him appear even more wretched. However, he didn't understand why the noble in front of him would bring him into the city and why he had to dress like this. The line quickly reached Fan Xian's group. Fan Xian noticed that although the Dingzhou soldiers were strict in their inspection, they did not take the opportunity to collect any benefits. Furthermore, they did not purposely make things difficult for the merchants and farmers from all over. Their speed was very fast. Mu Feng handed over the customs documents, travel passes, and tea deeds that he had prepared. The official stilled slightly and furrowed his brows. He seemed to find something strange. Fan Xian watched from the side with narrowed eyes. He didn't know what had gone wrong, but he didn't panic. In any case, in the afternoon, he was going to the governor's manor in Shiliang Road to reveal his identity. There shouldn't be any misunderstandings between the two sides. The official's surprise was not because there was something wrong with the documents. Rather, it was because they were too beautiful, particularly the seals and signatures. They were all from the heads of the yamens. Thus, it meant that the identities of this group of merchants were very important. Otherwise, why would the old officials in court personally inspect these documents? Fan Xian and his group had not expected that they would attract other people's attention. It was very simple for the Overwatch Council to make these documents. However, the Imperial Censorate had been keeping an eye on them recently, so they had simply gone to the various yamens to find the real thing. However, if it was too real, it would be too eye-catching. If it was still Wang Qinian responsible for all the details around Fan Xian, presumably he would not make such a mistake. The official glared coldly at Mu Feng, and then unconsciously glanced at Fan Xian. He understood that this noble and beautiful young man was the true leader of this group of merchants. Fan Xian did not look back at him. He was looking with interest at the Dingzhou city walls in front of him. He wondered to himself, Dingzhou is surrounded by plains or wasteland. Where did these large rocks come from? Is there yellow soil stuck between the rocks? Can this be used to build city walls? The official furrowed his brows. Unconsciously, he did not want to provoke this arrogant young man. He nodded and let them pass. After the group of merchants entered the city, he called over a subordinate and said a few words in a low voice. Fan Xian didn't know that his appreciation of the city walls would give the Dingzhou soldiers the impression that they were arrogant. He truly liked to use his own eyes to see everything in this world. After all, it was a rare second life. He always had a strong desire to explore the beauty, history, and existence around him. He had seen Shangjing's centuries-old city walls and was very familiar with Jingdou's heavily guarded city walls. It was rare for him to come to the westernmost city of the kingdom, Dingzhou, so he was curious. Furthermore, he still felt some regret in his heart. He didn't know when he would have the opportunity to see the legendary largest city in the world, Dongyi. The deputy, who had followed him into the city with a long face, gradually understood why the Duke of Danbua had brought a minor character like him into the city. The Duke was preparing to go shopping. The streets in Dingzhou were a mess with all kinds of streets intersecting. Without a local leading the way, there were many nameless places that would be impossible to find. What gave him a headache was that it seemed to be the first time the Duke of Danbua had come to such a remote place. Yet he was interested in everything. He wandered everywhere and did not find it tiring. In particular, the Hu people's weapons that had been shipped from the Hu people's tribes by Siqi River attracted his attention for a long time. In about half a day, Fan Xian and his group had strolled through the Dingzhou trading market area. They had perfectly carried out the enthusiasm a merchant group should have. Under a mud wall, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the distant city gate tower of Dingzhou. Lowering his voice, he asked, "Has the news been sent out?" Mu Feng carefully looked around and nodded. According to the agreement between the two sides, it has already been sent out. However, we came 2 days early. I'm afraid the other party hasn't entered the city yet. Fan Xian thought for a bit and said, "We had to come 2 days early. There's no way to block the news of me leaving the capital. Hongqing must know I'm coming. If I'm delayed by this kid, he will certainly force me to drink. How would I have time to do anything? Besides, who knows if there are Hu spies in the camp and the governor's manor?" Mu Feng glanced at the nervous deputy at the back of the group and said, "If I wasn't unfamiliar with the terrain, I really wouldn't have called for this person to lead the way. I don't know how to handle it in a bit. Fan Xian smiled and said, "It's not like it's a beheading. We just have to ensure the other party's safety. That's why we have to be so careful. As for the deputy, when we leave another day, we'll just send him 2 beauties." Although he said this, Fan Xian still felt some regret. The emperor had long forbidden the Overwatch Council from extending their tentacles too deeply into the military. Regardless of whether it was the 4th Bureau, which was in charge of the various roads, or the 2nd Bureau, which was in charge of gathering intelligence, the Overwatch Council did not have any capable people in Dingzhou. Of course, the Overwatch Council had certainly buried spies in Dingzhou. Fan Xian thought that the inside of Dingzhou was very safe, so he did not want to use these spies in case the military and political yamen were unhappy afterward. The ones who would suffer would be the lower-level officials of the Overwatch Council. The group of people stopped the carriage in a shady place and silently waited for the sun to slowly move. For lunch, they casually bought some sesame seed cakes and ate them with water. Fan Xian was no exception. Each time he moved, his actions always made the Overwatch Council subordinates feel closer. However, when the deputy saw the little duke also struggling to eat the sesame seed cake, he secretly sighed in amazement. When the shadow of the mud wall behind the carriage gradually grew longer, one of Fan Xian's subordinates returned humming a little tune. In his hands, he was still carrying the special Hu products he had bought along the way. It looked like he had been very careful along the way. At the back of the carriage, he threw these items back into the carriage and lowered his voice to say something to Fan Xian. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at Mu Feng. With a smile, he said, "Looks like they're more anxious than us. Let's go see them." Mu Fenger thought for a bit. This shouldn't be a trap. After all, Dingzhou was the Qing Kingdom's world. No one would have the guts to set up a trap for the Overwatch Council. He nodded and went to call for the deputy. Leaving the carriages, Fan Xian, Mu Fenger, and the deputy passed through the mud wall and through the bustling streets. They walked through the curious streets like merchants coming from the mainland for the first time. After walking for an indeterminable amount of time, they finally arrived at a lamb shop. Fan Xian looked at the shop without a signboard and couldn't resist smiling. "Damn, this place is really hard to find." He patted the deputy's shoulder. "Looks like you're not bad. You even know these places." The deputy felt his entire body go limp. He thought to himself that this shoulder had been patted by the Duke. It looked like he couldn't bear to bathe for half a month. No, he only bathed once a month. It should be because he didn't look for a woman for half a month. Not looking for a woman did not seem to be worth it. Just as the deputy's thoughts were running wild, Mu Fenger had already walked into the lamb shop. Turning his body sideways, he walked through the inner door of the mud room. Covering his nose, he walked into the inner room and sat on the mat he had arranged with the person. There were 4 mats in the inner door of the shop. On the mats were small tables that provided meat, food, and wine for customers. Each mat was separated by a thin cloth, but it could not block out the sound. It was just barely enough. Fan Xian sat in the innermost area. The deputy only dared to sit half on the outside. He muttered to himself, unsure why this noble figure had to come to this unremarkable shop. Was he here to see someone? Then, he fearfully accepted the bowl of wine the Duke handed over and carefully took a sip. He then fell into a deep sleep. After eating a few pieces of lamb and drinking 2 bowls of strong wine, Fan Xian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. He glanced at the thin cloth curtain beside him and gave Mu Fenger a meaningful glance. Mu Fenger thought for a moment and then picked up the wine bowl. Standing, he lifted the curtain and went to the mat on the other side. When the curtain was raised, Fan Xian's eyes were sharp. He saw that the person was about 40 or 50 years old. However, his face was dark. After all, he was a Hu person, so he couldn't see clearly. The sun was high in the sky and gradually rising. The mudroom was still quiet. It was not the right time to drink, so the shop was particularly quiet. There was only Fan Xian's group and the mysterious Hu person. No one knew what Mu Fenger said to the Hu person. After a long time, the curtain was pulled open. Mu Fenger nodded at Fan Xian to indicate that he had confirmed the other person's identity. Fan Xian turned his body and stared at the calm-looking Hu person. He found that the other person's hand was holding the wine bowl steadily. There was no change in his eyes. He slowly opened his mouth and said, "You are the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner. Why change your appearance and act so sneakily?" The Hu person put down his wine bowl and glanced at Fan Xian as if he wanted to know this young man's true identity. This gaze was like lightning, piercing straight to the heart and intimidating. However, Fan Xian's expression was cold, and he did not react at all. The Hu person's brows rose slightly. It was as if he had not thought that a random official from the Qing Overwatch Council would have such unfathomable shrewdness and power. "Correct. I am Hu Ge." The Hu person, who looked to be 40 or 50 years old, stared at Fan Xian's face with a hawk-like gaze. "He says you're the leader, so I will talk to you." Fan Xian smiled and raised the wine bowl in his hand. "There's not much I want to know. I must first confirm the princess's safety." Hu Ge, the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner of the Western Hu Kingdom. His reputation shook the western frontier and was deeply respected by the Hu people. His bearing was extraordinary. However, when he opened his mouth to speak the language of the Central Plains, he always felt awkward. For some reason, his aura weakened a bit. Fan Xian reached into his clothes and took out a jade hook, which he handed over. After Hu Ge accepted the jade hook, his brows furrowed tightly. It was as if he had sunk into deep thought. Fan Xian did not disturb his memories. He only watched this scene quietly. The Overwatch Council had made contact with this foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner, not because Fan Xian had exceptional abilities. Rather, he had used a troublesome method to come to them. Towards such people who came to them of their own accord, the Overwatch Council's usual way of dealing with them was not to be proactive, not to make promises, and not to take responsibility. It was not until he had indeed given the Overwatch Council some useful intelligence that the Overwatch Council began to follow up on this path. Other than Fan Xian himself, there was no one else who could follow up on this path. The reason for the relationship between Hu Ge and the Overwatch Council was Ma Suasa. Ma Suasa was still being hidden by Prince Hiqing, but in terms of belonging, she was, in the end, Fan Xian's person. This princess of a Hu tribe was a female captive, but also not a female captive. The tribe she belonged to had originally been prepared to surrender to the great prince's troops. However, before they could do so, they were exposed. The entire tribe had been completely slaughtered by the Western Hu king. The remaining tribe members could only scatter to the western regions and seek refuge with the nobility clans. Hu Ge was a warrior who had left this small tribe. Before he could reveal his identity and win glory for his tribe, he received the tragic news that his tribe had been slaughtered. After confirming Hu Ji's identity from Ma Suasa, Fan Xian began to strengthen his secret connection with Hu Ge. Not only did Ma Suasa know Hu Ge, but the two of them had been good friends when they were young. In the words of the Central Plains, they were childhood sweethearts. Fan Xian looked at his old face and muttered to himself. Did the Hu people age so easily when they were exposed to the wind and sun every day? Hu Ge carefully put the jade hook into his clothes. Looking at Fan Xian, he said, "I indeed want to avenge my tribe. Don't forget, I am also a Hu person. There are some things I can say and some things I cannot say. You Qing people are too sinister and cunning. I cannot trust you." Fan Xian understood this. If he wanted Hu Ge to lead the way for the Qing army and launch a surprise attack on the Western Hu King's camp, no one in the court would believe him, let alone whether or not he would be willing. He lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, "I don't need you to do anything. On the contrary, I can support you in doing something. I heard that the left virtuous prince's situation is not very good. If you can help him stand firm, presumably, your own power will also rise." Without waiting for the Hu tribe ace to speak, Fan Xian waved his hand crisply and said, "I don't ask for much in giving you support. First, you must think of all ways to stop the great attack next spring. Even if you can't stop it, I still need your intelligence. Don't worry, the Qing people are straightforward. We won't set up an ambush. We just need to set up a formation and scare each other. You should know how to arrange this." Hu Ge furrowed his brows and said, Right now, even the left virtuous prince's words have no power, much less mine. That's your problem. Since it is cooperation, you have to show some sincerity. Fan Xian looked at him calmly. I won't mistreat you. If you want to convince those people, you can't just rely on your fists. All the nobles in the world are the same. They all like gold, silver, jewelry, and silk. Hugo glanced at the young official across from him. I'll give you as much as you need to bribe. Fan Xian's tone was very normal, but it revealed a powerful confidence. Furthermore, you want to revive your tribe. Presumably, you'll need a large sum of money. Actually, making a deal with me is very simple. I only need to ask you one question. Do you want to get rich? Fan Xian had once asked some people this question, such as the previous commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard, Sir Shenzhong. Sir Shenzhong didn't want to get rich with Fan Xian. He wanted to get rich on his own, so he died. Then, Fan Xian had asked the Northern Qi imperial uncle, Marquis Chongning. This Marquis was very willing to get rich with Fan Xian. Not only did his family get rich, but Wei Hua also became a high-ranking official. History had long proven that those who worked with Fan Xian were always very happy. But Hugo did not know the other party's true identity. He said in a cold voice, "Everyone likes gold and silver, but your words are unbelievable. So much silver, and even goods that can't be bought with silver, you want me to agree to it with just one word? Don't lie to me. Although we, the men of the prairie, are straightforward, we are not fools." Fan Xian's words did indeed sound like a lie. There were many king's tents on the grasslands and countless nobles. These nobles were all insatiably greedy. If they wanted to fill their appetites, they would need the Qing court's strong support. How could a young official of the Overwatch Council make this decision? I can give you a good knife produced by the palace treasury. Fan Xian didn't respond to his words. Coldly, he said, however, the quantity is limited. After all, I don't want the knife I give you to chop at the necks of the Qing people. Fan Xian didn't answer Hu Ji's question. On the contrary, Hugo felt even more uneasy. He stared at the young and handsome face and asked in a low and icy voice, "Who exactly are you?" Fan Xian glanced at him and said, "I am Fan Xian." With a crisp clang, Hu Ji's back slammed heavily into the dirt wall. He quickly pulled out the curved knife at his waist and aimed it at Fan Xian. The dust on the dirt wall fell down and stained the food and wine on the table. Hugo looked at Fan Xian with great caution. A glimmer of fear rose in his eyes. Fan Xian lowered his head and tapped his fingers on the table. He had not thought that his true identity would scare the other party to such an extent. How could this person be called the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner? He had no idea that the name of Commissioner Fan of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council had long resounded through the world, far away from where the Hu people lived. In the hearts of the Qing people, Sir Fan Jr. was brilliant and eye-catching. In the eyes of the Qing Kingdom's enemies, this legendary young man was the #1 target to guard against. Up until now, the Hu people had never been taken advantage of by Fan Xian. However, they had been taken advantage of by Chun Pingping many times. Thus, they had endless fear and wariness toward Chun Pingping's successor. After Fan Xian admitted his identity, Hu Ji's first thought was that today's meeting was a trap. His second thought was that if this was not a trap, then this transaction would also consign the Hu people to eternal damnation. Don't be so afraid. Fan Xian raised his head and slowly said, "Correct. I'm the head of the Overwatch Council. Don't worry, I'm also a good businessman. Don't forget, I control the court's palace treasury. If you don't believe in my trustworthiness, you can send someone to the Central Plain to investigate." I'm not afraid. Hugo had already calmed down. A wolf-like wildness appeared in his eyes. Staring at Fan Xian, he enunciated each word clearly. "I just didn't think that someone of your status would lower himself to come see me and be so brave. This is the world of the Qing Kingdom. This is Dingzhou. I don't think there is anything special about my courage." Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Even a Hu person like you dares to come see me. Why wouldn't I dare to see you? You don't know how much your head is worth," Hugo said. Are you not afraid that I will set a trap here and kill you? Fansian glanced at him mockingly and wiped the meat oil in his hand onto the cloth curtain beside him. This shop is filled with your people from top to bottom. If I was afraid of you setting a trap, why would I come in and sit and drink? Besides, do you think you, the so-called foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner, can kill me? Fansian furrowed his brows as if he was looking at an insensible child. You have a long name, but your courage is not much. A person's name was like a tree's shadow. The most powerful ace of the younger generation in the Qin kingdom had long branded his figure in the hearts of all martial artists. Hu Gu indeed did not have the courage to carry out such a dangerous attempt. Fansian stood and stared into his eyes. I don't care what you're thinking. Since my conditions are out, I want to know that person's name. This was the piece of intelligence that the Overwatch Council cared about the most in their probing contact with the other party during these 3 months. The person hidden in the Hu King's tent was hidden very deeply. Furthermore, he had brought great harm to the Qin kingdom. The Overwatch Council and Bureau of Military Affairs had tried everything they could, but were still unable to find out who that person was. Even the two councils were not sure if there was such a terrifying military advisor in the Hu tribes, or if the two virtuous kings and the chief had suddenly been enlightened. Fansian did not think so. The Qing emperor also did not think so. The father and son had the same judgment. It was easy to change mountains and rivers, but it was difficult to change a person's nature. The changes in Shihu must have been influenced by outside forces. They were certain that that person existed. This was the most important goal of Fan Xian's trip to Dingzhou. He wanted to dig out that person. Hu Gu was the highest-ranking figure the Qin court could come into contact with among the Hu tribe. He had been urged for a long time. Hearing these words again, the expression of this Hu tribe ace changed. He knew how much help he would receive from the Qin court. Furthermore, Sua's life and death were in the hands of this young man in front of him. He didn't have much of a choice. However, Chapter 598. Songji Xianling? This was a completely unfamiliar name. Fan Xian thought of a person called Songgon Zanpu. He shook his head and said, "This is the language of the grasslands." His brows suddenly rose. He thought that if this mysterious person had come to the grasslands from the outside, then this alias must have a true meaning. However, it should have its own meaning. This is the tribal language of the brothers in the north. It is not the language of the grasslands. Hu Gu sheathed his curved knife and said seriously, "I've investigated for 3 months and can already confirm that this person came to the grasslands with the northern tribes. I'm not sure about the meaning of Songji Xianling, but the Xianling should mean twinkling." Fan Xian's brows furrowed. Twinkling, twinkling, diamond, diamond, twinkling? He immediately thought of the name wrongly. He didn't think that twinkling could be an adjective or some kind of movement, such as flowers blooming. This proved that the Hu tribes did not have a unified language and would indeed bring trouble to many people. Fan Xian's head hurt. He had too little information on hand. What use could a name have? Helplessly, he raised his eyes and looked at Hu Gu. The brothers in the north are still moving toward the grasslands? Hu Gu nodded with a serious expression. It is already the 4th year. The first year, it was the brothers in the north who came as scouts. There weren't many people. The second year, it was the warriors among the brothers in the north. This group had the most people. In the last 2 years, it has mainly been the elderly, women, and children who had stayed in the north. They have moved with great difficulty along the path open to the side of the meridian of the sky. If Songji Xianling is a tribe member in the north, then what year did he come to the grasslands? It should be the group from before. Although this person is mysterious, since he can influence the decisions of the king's tent, he must have the absolute support of the brothers in the north. Otherwise, who would listen to him? You're saying? Fan Xian stared into Hu Ji's eyes. The brothers in the north have already established themselves on the grasslands and received the king's approval. This is natural. They are very brave. Although there are only tens of thousands of them, almost all of them are warriors. Additionally, their tribes are more united than the people on the grasslands. Furthermore, their requests for water and grass areas are not greedy. Regardless of whether it is the king's tent or the two virtuous kings, they all welcome their arrival, Hugo said seriously. Hugo said very seriously, also, our brothers in the north never participate in the internal struggles of the grasslands, so they're the targets of all parties. Although their voices are still steady, they seem to be getting louder and louder in our ears. Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything. The source of the Qing kingdom's tight situation on the western border was because of the continuous natural disasters to the north of northern Qi. Heavy snow sealed the plains and forced the northern barbarians to migrate tens of thousands of li to the grasslands. The ruthlessness of the western Hu and the tyranny of the northern barbarians combined. The pressure on the Qing border increased. He felt a chill in his heart. If the Hu people truly united, Qing kingdom would be in big trouble. After decades of Qing kingdom conquest, the Hu people had long been weak. Additionally, there was the Overwatch Council's 30 years of slightly weakening provocations and evil schemes. The Shihu side was not a threat. No one would have thought that the arrival of the northern barbarians would be like a shot in the arm for the Hu people. Songji Xianling seemed to have a way to bridge the divide between the Hu people. Tell me about the current situation on the grasslands. Fan Xian looked at Hugo in front of him. His expression was calm, but he was thinking that even if Songji Xianling could temporarily unite the Hu people, since he had found Hugo, he would certainly be able to tear open a large hole within the Hu people. When he thought of this, he couldn't help but feel a little excited. If the plains were a game of chess, then the next step would be for him and that Songji Xianling to place their pieces on the board. They would go back and forth and see who would emerge victorious in the end. Of course, it was him, Fan Xian thought. He had to win because he had acutely captured Songji Xianling's plan hidden in the deepest depths. He greatly loathed her thoughts. The temperature difference between day and night in the west was great. The sun slowly moved. It was as if the temperature in Dingzhou had given some order. It gradually heated up and cooled down. When the shadow of the mud wall in the city grew longer and longer, the sun set in the west, and the temperature grew lower and lower. Fan Xian and Hu Ji's first meeting came to an end. In his mind, he thought over the information he had obtained from Hu Ji's mouth. Fan Xian confirmed that he had benefited greatly from this trip. He then confirmed the method of contact with the other party, as well as the details of the contact, and began the final exchange of benefits. Regardless of whether it was gold, silver, treasures, silk, tea, or porcelain, it was all transported to the grasslands and handed to Hu Ji's hands without anyone knowing. This in itself was a troublesome matter. Fortunately, although the grasslands and Qing kingdom had fought for decades, the tribes on the grasslands had long become accustomed to paying tribute because the Qing kingdom had always held an absolute advantage. The trade between the two sides had never stopped. In other words, while the two sides were shooting poison arrows at each other at the foot of Tian Shan, perhaps on the other side of the mountain, merchants were laboriously making their way to the grasslands to transport goods to the heart of the central plain in exchange for furs and other things. War and commerce did not interfere with each other. However, it would be difficult to privately smuggle important goods like ironware, salt, and grain. Since Fan Xian had the emperor's personal edict, he did not care about this. Hearing Fan Xian's last words, Hugo furrowed his brows and said, "Commissioner, there is trust between us. That is why I am telling you this path. I hope you won't disappoint me. If you really disappoint me, believe me, I won't need the king's tent to move troops. On the grasslands, I will be able to destroy you." Fan Xian knew what this Hu tribe ace was afraid of. He shook his head and said, "Don't worry. Although the scenery on your side is beautiful, I am not used to drinking horse wine. I have no interest in bringing an army over." Having obtained the promise, Hugo relaxed slightly. He raised his wine bowl and toasted Fan Xian. He then drained it in one gulp. The wine spilled down and wet his beard and clothes. Fan Xian smiled and raised his wine bowl, preparing to end this transaction. Unexpectedly, he heard a light whistle come from outside the shop. His brows immediately furrowed, and he placed the wine bowl back on the table. This whistle was very light, like a shepherd herding a camel. It did not attract the attention of Hu Ji's people. Hugo noticed that Fan Xian had placed the wine bowl back on the table. His heart jumped slightly. He thought that Fan Xian still had some conditions. He thought to himself that the Qing people were indeed cunning and always liked to make exorbitant demands. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Are there any problems with the people you brought?" Hu Ji's expression froze slightly. He understood that a problem had occurred outside the shop. He shook his head and said, "They are all children of my tribe, scattered to various places. There is absolutely no problem." He knew that the matter was urgent. As he spoke, he began to pack his things and prepare to flee. If the Dingzhou military and governments knew he was in the city, they would stop at nothing to capture him. The two sides had fought fiercely these few years. If they could capture the top ace under the left virtuous king's banner, Dingzhou would be overjoyed. Fan Xian watched his movements but did not rise. He lowered his head and quietly said, "They are still outside the street. The encirclement has not formed. Leave from the back of the house. I'll hold them off for a while for you." Hugo looked at him with a strange feeling. He had taken the risk to come to Dingzhou. He had not thought that the person to meet him would be Commissioner Fan of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council, such an honorable figure. It was precisely because Fan Xian had personally come that Hu Ge had placed more trust in him. This was very beneficial to their future cooperation. "I won't see you out." Fan Xian raised his wine bowl and said, "Be careful on your journey. We'll meet again another day." Hu Ge nodded his head heavily and accepted the heavy package Mu Feng handed over. Putting his finger to his lips, he whistled. Lifting the curtain, he followed the hole in the earth toward the back of the lamb shop. At the same time, a few unremarkable merchants and workers outside the lamb shop also blended into the crowd. They're used to hiding everywhere. After all, their tribe has been massacred for many years. If they want to restore their tribe, there will always be many things that cannot be seen in the light. Mu Feng looked at Fan Xian, who had his head lowered as he drank. He knew what he was worried about and said, "I called the police early. Dingzhou will not be able to catch him." Fan Xian nodded. A few subordinates of the Overwatch Council disguised as Central Plain merchants rushed in and reported, "The guards of the Western Camp have entered the dirt street and will be here soon." Mu Feng glanced at Fan Xian, meaning to ask if he should retreat at this time. Fan Xian shook his head. Since the Dingzhou army had their eyes on them, then the carriages they had left at the mud wall earlier were also controlled by the other party. The three of them came to the lamb shop, but they left a few 6th Bureau subordinates behind to follow them from a distance. This was to prevent any accidents from happening. Since the two sides had met, there was no need to retreat. For the safety of Hu Ge and his group, Fan Xian had to delay the Qing soldiers capturing the spies for a while. "If the other party doesn't deal a heavy blow, we won't make a move." Fan Xian took a sip of wine and spoke to his subordinates. Mu Feng, and the Overwatch Council officials met each other's eyes and nodded. At this moment, there was a commotion outside the lamb shop and the startling sound of horse hooves. Countless people charged in and surrounded the shop. Faintly, one could hear an official's loud cry. It was like he had discovered that a target had left the lamb shop. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and felt it was very troublesome. He stood up from the brick bed, turned around, and pulled out a piece of bamboo from the mat. He then walked out of the shop. There was a murderous aura outside the shop. There were at least 200 Dingzhou soldiers surrounding the shop. The long spears in their hands were aimed at the people walking out of the shop. The tips of the spears shot out wildly. It was as if they could turn the Central Plain merchants into mincemeat at any moment. Outside the encirclement were the well-behaved merchants. They watched this scene with curiosity and nervousness. They didn't know why the people of the general's manor would use such a large force to deal with these merchants. The clever ones had already guessed that the identities of these merchants were probably not that simple. "I can't let anyone suspect the escaped Hu Ge because of my existence." This was the true meaning hidden in the order Fan Xian had given earlier. This spy the Overwatch Council had hidden in Shi Lake was too important. Fan Xian didn't even dare trust anyone, much less in front of so many people. A soldier moved closer to the officer's ear and said something. The officer's eyes lit up. Presumably, he had confirmed the other party's identity. Looking at Fan Xian and his group, he said in a cold voice, "Someone capture these spies." Fan Xian looked at the soldier's face and recognized him as the soldier guarding the east gate. It was this person who had examined their documents to enter the city. He immediately knew where the problem was. He couldn't help smiling helplessly and glancing at Mu Feng. Mu Feng knew that he had made some mistakes in his handling of the details and had aroused the suspicions of Ding Zhou. He was angry in his heart, but he was afraid of angering Fan Xian. His expression became increasingly ugly. Surrounded by countless spears, he looked at the officer with a cold expression. His gaze was as if he was about to bring a bowl of water and swallow him alive. The officer didn't know what these merchants were thinking. Seeing that there was not a glimmer of fear on their faces, he became more and more certain that there was something strange about these merchants. As he prepared to give orders and send out a portion of his subordinates to continue capturing the people who had escaped, he urged his horse to stop in front of the merchants. He couldn't let the Dingzhou army catch up to Hu Ge. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. Mu Feng received the order. A cold light flashed through his eyes. With a push of his feet, yellow sand appeared. His entire body had already flipped up like a gray shadow. Pressing his palm against the horse's head, a short knife flew out from his sleeve. He was about to restrain the careless officer. Since the officer dared to ride alone in front of everyone, he had great confidence in his skills. Seeing the sudden change, he was not surprised at all. Raising the sheath of his knife with one hand, he slapped it toward Mu Feng's wrist. His right hand left the reins and went straight for Mu Feng's throat. His movements were clean and efficient. It was the authentic Yi family's grappling skills. This officer's martial arts were indeed powerful, but he only thought that these merchants might be spies. He had no idea of their true identities and couldn't help but underestimate them. He blocked Mu Feng, but he couldn't block the black shadows that rose up at almost the same time as Mu Feng. With a number of swishing sounds, the shadows descended on the officer's horse at the same time. One grabbed the hand, the other grabbed the throat. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau attacked. Even Fan Xian was afraid of them, much less this unremarkable soldier of Dingzhou. With a wail, the horse suddenly realized that there were 4 people standing on its back. How could it withstand it? Its front hooves softened and it fell down. A cloud of dust rose. The Dingzhou soldiers were shocked. They watched helplessly as their leader was easily captured by the spies. Mu Feng took the officer's knife sheath and placed the knife in his hand across his neck. Facing the Dingzhou soldiers charging over from all directions, he shouted, "If you're not afraid of death, then come." The officer's face was deathly white. He had not thought that he would not be able to block one move from these spies. Gritting his teeth, he roared at his subordinates, "Capture these people." He now believed that these people were not only spies, but very powerful spies. For the sake of Dingzhou's safety, why would they care about his life or death? He didn't care, but Fan Xian did. If conflict truly erupted, the Dingzhou army would not be able to keep them. But how would they explain it to the court? "We are not spies." Fan Xian walked forward and looked at everyone warmly. "We are just merchants." With this disturbance, the officer did not have time to give the order to chase. Hu Ge and his group should have already safely escaped the encirclement. Fan Xian's state of mind had also calmed down. He indicated for his subordinates to put down the weapons in their hands. Smiling slightly at the brave officer, he said, "Sir, my subordinates are all rash people. I've frightened you." Naturally, no one believed such words. Even the most rash of Jianghu people would not attack the court's army. The officer touched his tight throat and found that he was still surrounded by these spies. Looking at Fan Xian in the lead, he ruthlessly said, "Let's see where else you can escape to." "We won't escape. We are truly just merchants. We just overreacted earlier." After saying this, Fan Xian couldn't help but want to cry. "Hu Ge, oh Hu Ge, I have truly caused a great deal of trouble for you." "Is that so? Which family are you merchants from?" The officer looked at Fan Xian darkly as if he was not at all worried about his safety. The Dingzhou soldiers outside didn't know what they were talking about. They only went to make an urgent report to the general's manor. At the same time, they set up the encirclement. No one paid any more attention to the people who could escape from the back of the shop. The Lingnan Xiong family, Mu Fenger, said, "Since you are merchants, come back with me to the manor for inspection." The officer gritted his teeth so hard they almost shattered. He roared angrily. "Otherwise, kill them on the spot." In his opinion, these spies were probably about to break out of the encirclement. However, they were controlling him, so it was inconvenient for his subordinates to act. No matter what, if he suggested that these merchants come with him to the general's manor for questioning, the other party would certainly not accept. Unexpectedly, after the young and handsome merchant thought for a moment, he nodded and said, "Very well, we are law-abiding merchants. Of course, we are willing to explain ourselves." The officer furrowed his brows. He didn't know what these spies were thinking. Did they not know that once they were captured, what awaited them would be endless beatings and interrogation? However, since the other party was so muddle-headed and stupid, the officer would not miss this opportunity. "Tie your own hands." He looked at Fan Xian and roared loudly. Fan Xian was obedient, truly obedient. He was even more obedient than he was in front of the emperor. He obediently allowed the Dingzhou soldiers to tie him up like a rice dumpling. Furthermore, his shoulder was hit heavily by a soldier. It was truly painful. The Overwatch Council officials under him were also obedient and obediently allowed themselves to be captured without a trace of struggle. On the contrary, it confused the Dingzhou soldiers. Because these merchant-like spies had once subdued their immediate superior in one move, these soldiers did not hold back. As they tied them up, they secretly used some heavy blows. Fan Xian stood by the officer's side and pleaded, "Don't hit people." The officer glared at him. He couldn't understand how this spy could be so daring. Resisting in the street was a small matter, but he could still speak to him so calmly. "There is still someone in the shop who has been drugged by us. Don't forget to bring him back with you." Fan Xian was more like a Dingzhou advisor. "What's with all this nonsense? Just wait until you can't even die if you want to," he said sinisterly as he stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Fan Xian did not get angry. He forced a smile and said, "The merchants I brought into the city have presumably also been captured by you. Please say something and don't torture them." The officer glanced at him mockingly. He had seen countless spies, but this was the first time he had seen someone as childish and laughable as Fan Xian. Fan Xian looked at him and said seriously, "We didn't kill you earlier. How about you return our favor?" The officer became more and more confused. He felt a chill in the depths of his heart and wondered if he had done something wrong. He subconsciously stopped his subordinates from beating up the spies. Something major had happened in Dingzhou. Another group of spies had been captured. Although there were spies every year and there were new ones every month, the spies captured in the lamb shop were different. First, they had come from the heart of the Central Plain. No one knew if they wanted to do illicit salt business with Shihu or if they had a bigger plan. Second, these spies were clearly strange. The upper echelons of the Dingzhou army took great interest in this group of spies. They had always disagreed with the court and Overwatch Council's decisions. They thought that there was no godlike military advisor in the Western Hu King's tent. The reason the Hu people had been so powerful these years was all because someone within the court had colluded with them and provided them with large amounts of support. These merchant spies who came from Jiangnan through Jingdou seemed to confirm this point even more clearly. This was a serious matter, so there was no time to use torture to interrogate these spies. Before the governor's manor could reach out, the commander of the military in Dingzhou had ordered the spies to be escorted back to the general's manor. When it came to stealing credit, regardless of whether it was the front line or the rear, it was all the same. The officer escorted Fan Xian and his group into the general's manor. He found that the general was personally interrogating them. He couldn't help feeling happy. He thought to himself that although he had made a fool of himself today, he had captured these important people. His merits still outweighed his faults. "We still haven't had time to ask." The general, sitting at the top, ground his teeth until they creaked. "Then what are we waiting for? First, break their legs, and then flog them 30 times. Then we can question them. The Dingzhou soldiers below shouted in unison and prepared to take action. The general spat on the ground and cursed, "Mother of Asterisker, how dare you not kneel in front of me? You're quite unyielding. What bullsh asterisk T Xiong family of Lingnan? Even if you're from Xia Mingji, I'll still beat you up." Everyone in court and the military knew that Xia Mingji was Commissioner Fan's family property. There was basically no one in this world who dared to not give Fan Xian face. Strangely, this general's tone did not sound like he was bragging. Fan Xian raised his head with a pained expression and looked at the bearded general of the Western expedition. He wondered why this kid was so ugly. He sighed and said, "We can't beat them." The Western expedition camp's imperial general, Li Hongcheng, was angrily drinking strong wine. He wondered why these bastard Hu people never let him relax. Suddenly hearing these words, he unconsciously looked down the hall and unexpectedly saw a familiar face. The features on that face had changed slightly, but the mischievousness in his eyes was just as strong as it was in the past. Chapter 599. The official wiped away the wine on his face and looked stupidly at the general. He didn't know why the general was angry. Was it because he had embarrassed the general's manner on the street earlier? So the general was using this method of spraying strong wine in his face to express his strong disdain for him? General Li Hongsheng didn't even glance at this trusted aide. He looked stupidly at Fan Xian, disguised as a merchant in the hall. He opened his mouth and used his index finger to point downward. He tapped quickly but didn't say anything. Fan Xian glanced at him, narrowed his eyes, and shook his head imperceptibly. Li Hongcheng quickly suppressed the shock in his heart. He coughed and cleared his throat. Glancing at his subordinates around him, he said, "All of you, go down and organize the files. In a moment, the governor's manor will come to snatch people. Stop them with all you might." Yes. The soldiers who had escorted the spy into the manor accepted the order and left. However, the official and a few of the general's trusted aides and secretaries did not leave. "General, we're not interrogating him?" The official wiped the wine off his face and looked at his superior with confusion. Li Hongcheng flew into a rage and said, "Interrogating my ass? We can't beat him. How can we interrogate him? Can't beat him? Could it be that the words of the spy had really convinced the great general?" The official looked at Li Hongsheng like an idiot and couldn't react for a moment. He felt that life seemed to be too absurd. After the manor had quieted down, Fan Xian opened his mouth and asked with a smile, "These 4 people haven't left. It looks like they are your trusted aides?" Li Hongsheng had long jumped up from the hall. As he walked down, he muttered, "Nonsense. If they aren't trustworthy people, they wouldn't dare stay here." "That's good." Fan Xian didn't seem to use much strength, but the ox tendon ropes binding his arms snapped inch by inch and fell to the ground. The 4 trusted aides of the general's manor stared with wide eyes, not daring to believe their own eyes. They wondered what kind of ace this person was. They had a deeper understanding of the absurdity of life. This was an ox tendon rope specially made by the military. It was enough to tie up a 9th-level ace. How could this person so easily break free? They had no idea that the tyrannical Jinshi in Fan Xian's body had already reached its peak. Coupled with the special nature of this Jinshi, once it was fully unleashed, it could be said to be invincible. The 4 of them watched as Fan Xian escaped. Unconsciously, they wanted to pull out their weapons and attack. Fortunately, they were not truly idiots. They could already see that the situation on the field was a bit strange. They hesitantly looked at each other and felt weak in their legs. Fan Xian touched his bound wrists and looked at Li Hongsheng in front of him. "Your subordinates are really ruthless." "Nonsense." Li Hongcheng punched him on the shoulder and said, "Why are you here, you little brat?" He almost caused a big mess. Fan Xian felt the pain and said, "I was hit by your people. Don't hammer me." Li Hongcheng heard it clearly. This bastard was using the opportunity to snitch on him. As a general, he knew the way the people under him did things. He also knew that someone of Fan Xian's status would not retaliate over such a small matter. He chuckled and didn't reply. He wanted to muddle his way through. "Sir?" The officer finally found it difficult to bear the absurdity of his life and couldn't resist opening his mouth to ask. Fan Xian turned around and pointed at the still, sleeping deputy official on the chair. "This person knows my identity. Don't let him out for now. We'll talk about it after the matter is finished." Li Hongqing nodded and hugged his shoulder. Smiling widely, he said, "News from the capital says it will be at least 10 days before you arrive. Coming so early, is there something good? I am now the local tyrant of Dingzhou. If there's anything good, you can give me a share." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and glanced at him. He felt more and more strange at his heart. Why was this noble heir now like a ruffian? Particularly with the sour smell on his body. He shivered and broke away from the other person's warm embrace. "There's nothing good, but there's a pile of bad things. In any case, I can't tell you. There are just some things I need your help with." When these two superiors talked about serious matters, they forgot these subordinates to the side. The 4 trusted aides of the general's manor had already faintly heard the origins of these so-called spies. They couldn't help but look at each other. They then looked at the people tied up like dumplings with green and red patches on their faces. Involuntarily, their hearts began to pound. They thought to themselves that if they really beat up the court spies, given the legendary ruthless and protective temper of the Overwatch Council's old ancestor and little ancestor, what would they do? Should we untie these brothers? The officer couldn't resist asking Li Hongqing. Li Hongqing scolded, "Troublesome little ruffians. Hurry up and untie them." Quickly, these 4 people released Fan Xian's Overwatch Council subordinates. They then stood to the side, at a loss as to what to do. They smiled apologetically and said apologetic words. The Overwatch Council subordinates did not show any anger. They were used to being spies, so they didn't care about such small problems. Seal off the news. Not a single word of it can get out. As for if anyone asks about the spies that were brought into the manor today, say the general's manor is secretly interrogating them. No one knew what Fan Xian said to Li Hongqing. Li Hongqing turned his head and said a few things in a cold voice. He then gave some orders to ensure that the whereabouts of Fan Xian and his group would not be revealed. In 3 days, choose some prisoners on death row from the prison. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "My subordinates will help clean up the people in your manor as to what to do next. Naturally, they will do these things. We have to talk first." Li Hongqing continued to hold Fan Xian's arm like he was afraid he would run. He dragged him toward the back garden. The remaining officials of the general's manor and the Overwatch Council watched as their immediate superiors left with their arms around each other's shoulders. They couldn't help but stare at each other and sink into silence. They didn't know how to address each other or how to deal with related matters. After a long time, it was still the officer who had brought them into the manor who coughed and looked at Mu Feng. In a gentle voice, he said, "Sir, are you from the council?" Mu Feng nodded and did not give this person a pleasant expression. "Then, that sir earlier was Sir Fan Jr.?" The officer lowered his voice and asked with slight fear. Mu Feng knew of the close relationship between the commissioner and King Jing's heir and nodded his head seriously. The officer swallowed. Only now did he know what kind of person he had captured. Thinking that the other party was the little ancestor of the Overwatch Council he had been afraid of earlier, his face began to pale, whiter than the flowers on the grasslands. The general's manor was originally the manor of the Yi family. Later, Li Hongqing entered the Western Expedition Army. Given his identity, he had always lived here. 2 years ago, during the Jingdou Rebellion, half of the Dingzhou army entered the capital to quell the rebellion. Yi Zhong and Gong Dian remained in Jingdou and never returned. Thus, the general's manor became Li Hongqing's private manor and office. There were no other people in the manor. Walking all the way to the back garden, they didn't see a single servant. Fan Xian was secretly surprised, but he didn't show it on his face. Sitting on a cold stone bench in the garden, he got used to the cold and harsh atmosphere that was completely different from the gardens of the Central Plain. Only then did he speak carefully and say, You have to explain clearly to your subordinates that no one can think that I entered Dingzhou today. So wordy. You came 10 days early to do business. The problem is, given your current identity, what is there to be afraid of? Li Hongsheng carried a large pot of wine and poured 2 bowls, placing them in front of each other. I don't want people with ulterior motives to guess that I'm here to see someone because of my early arrival. Li Hongqing's hand holding the pot of wine paused for a moment. Fan Xian looked at him and said, I won't hide this from you. I buried a spy on the grasslands. Today, I came to see the spy, but he emphasized his tone. Other than you, I don't want anyone else to know about this because the life and death of that spy will affect the lives and deaths of many people in the Qin Kingdom. Li Hongqing thought for a moment and then nodded. He then said, just as you said earlier, I will take care of it. I will pick some prisoners on the death row to impersonate you. It will not raise any suspicions of people outside. There is one more important thing, Fan Xian said. The council needs a path to the Shihu tribe, and I don't want to be raided by the troops under your command, so I need your cooperation. Li Hongsheng had already shaken off his earlier surprise and recovered his calm. What exactly do you want to do? I will only remind you of one thing. Any grain you send to the grasslands could kill a soldier of the Qin Kingdom. Without waiting for Fan Xian to open his mouth to explain, Li Hongsheng stared into his eyes and continued, I don't care what the court thinks. I don't care what schemes Director Chen has. I don't care if you're preparing to raise a spy to cause internal strife among the Hu people. However, I must remind you that the Hu people are a completely different kind of existence. You are not on the border, so you don't know their savagery and fickleness. You have to be careful about nurturing a tiger and inviting disaster. Fan Xian could feel the affection contained in the other party's warning. He nodded and comfortingly said, Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. He raised his wine bowl and drank it all with Li Hongsheng. He then let out a long breath and looked at the other party's bearded face and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The two of them sank into silence at the same time. The back garden was completely silent. King Jing's heir, Li Hongsheng, had joined the army 3 years ago. During these 3 years, he had bravely killed the enemy and led the troops in battle. His reputation had long spread back to Jingdou and the Central Plain. The people all praised that after the great prince's western expedition, the royal family had finally produced another powerful figure who could lead troops into battle. It was because of his military service that this member of the royal family, who once had an unclear relationship with the second prince, was able to obtain the emperor's trust and take over Yizhong's position. He began to control the military affairs of the entire Dingzhou Western camp. However, it had already been 3 years. This once dissolute, confident, and handsome heir had been polished into a different appearance by the wind and sand of the frontier fortress. Furthermore, he had not returned to Jingdou in 3 years. 3 years. Although the border is tight, looking at how you are in the general's manner, it's not like you don't have time to return to the capital. Fan Xian filled 2 bowls with strong wine and quietly said, Why don't you go back? Li Hongqing's hand gripped the edge of the wine bowl. His expression was heavy. After a long time, he slowly said, Go back to do what? Fan Xian knew what he was afraid of and glanced at him with disapproval. It's all in the past. If the emperor doubted you, how could he let you control the affairs of Dingzhou? To put it nicely, I am a general, but my control over the army is far lacking compared to the Yi families, Li Hongsheng said with his head lowered. Li Hongsheng lowered his head and said, Of course, I also don't want the Western camp to become my family soldiers. As you can see, I only have 4 trusted aides in the manor. The officer who brought you into the manor is a member of the Yi family. I can trust him, but I can't trust the officials in Jingdou. During these 2 years, the emperor has carried out a total of 4 rotations. 1 in Yinjing, 1 in Nanzhao, and the other 4 roads have all come to Dingzhou to play. Li Hongsheng raised his head and stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Although you have never been in command of an army, you should know that famous generals use experienced soldiers. This iron camp is truly flowing soldiers. If the general doesn't know the soldiers, how can a battle be good? When you return to Jingdou this time, You have to help me with something. Tell the emperor that the rotation cannot continue, Li Hongqiang said in a heavy tone. The replenishment of troops has indeed become more than enough because of the rotation, but when it comes to fighting, it is not the case at all. Furthermore, the attacks of the 14 Hu tribes are becoming fiercer and more cunning. Fan Xian cut off his words and said, I know you've sent a document to the Bureau of Military Affairs. I've also seen the secret memorial you sent to the emperor, but you should know why the emperor has rotated these 2 years. Yanjing and Sangzhou are in a stalemate. The emperor is using the Hu people to sharpen his knives and train his soldiers for the future. It is a very difficult matter for you to make the emperor stop this move. I don't care about the great cause of unifying the world, Li Hongqiang said angrily. Li Hongqiang said angrily, That's right. If the day of the war comes, I am willing to be the emperor's vanguard and fight to the death on the battlefield. But right now, we are in such a tight spot. If Shiliang Road is really crippled by the Hu people, how can we unify the world? At this moment, there was only Fan Xian and him in the garden, so his words were particularly direct. He criticized the emperor's national policy as bullsh*t. In any case, he knew Fan Xian's personality and didn't care if he heard it. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, What can I do? In terms of military affairs, the emperor has never allowed me to interfere. It's not like you don't know. Li Hongqiang sighed and raised his wine bowl to drink it all in one gulp. Cursing, he said in a low and pained voice, It is possible to use war to train soldiers. However, 10 batches of new soldiers come, 7 batches go back, and 3 batches die on the grasslands. If we still use the old Dingzhou soldiers or the old subordinates of the Western Expedition Army that the Great Prince brought out, these people wouldn't have to die. But Fan Xian knew he had to remind Hongqiang of some things to prevent him from unknowingly committing a taboo in the future. If we only use the Dingzhou army and the old subordinates of the Western Expedition Army, how can we attack northern Qi and Dongyi? During the Jingdo Rebellion 2 years ago, the Qin family's rebel army was almost completely wiped out. The internal structure of the army suddenly became unstable, and military power dropped rapidly. The emperor must use Dingzhou to pick up the edge of the Qing army again. There's no need to talk about this anymore. Don't bring this up to the court again. Not only will it have no effect, but it will also make the emperor unhappy. Of course, the emperor won't just watch you suffer here alone. A slightly mocking smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Am I not also here? Li Hongqiang shook his head and didn't continue to discuss this topic. Fan Xian looked at him and suddenly said, How often do you bathe now? Li Hongqiang paused. I don't remember. About half a month to a month? Fan Xian sniffled and laughingly scolded. No wonder you smell so bad. Li Hongqiang glared at him. Fan Xian smiled. Dingzhou has deep wells. There's no shortage of water. Furthermore, you're a general. Can't you even bathe? I'm too lazy. Li Hongqiang smiled and shook his head. If you were like me and had once spent half a year fighting the Hu people on the grasslands and deserts, you would also be used to days without bathing. Besides, it's all work that involves fighting and carrying sticks. Beside me are a group of rough people. Who would care about this? The subordinates don't care, but do the concubines in the manor not care? Fan Xian picked up a cucumber and stuffed it into his mouth to chew as he spoke indistinctly. Li Hongqiang paused. A moment later, he smiled slightly and said, There are no concubines in the manor. The people of the Yi family have all returned to the capital. I only left behind a few servants. Fan Xian raised his head in shock, not daring to believe his ears. King Jing's heir, Li Hongqiang, had been famous in Jingdo for his dissolute ways. He secretly helped the second prince manage half the brothels and women under heaven. It could truly be said that he had a new person by his bed every night. Now, he was alone in Dingzhou without a single concubine by his side. Seeming to guess what Fan Xian was thinking, Li Hongqiang used his index finger to gently tap the wine bowl and quietly said, Oh, who doesn't like it? So I quit. Fan Xian was speechless. A moment later, he faintly said, "I've let you down in this matter." "What have you done to let me down?" Li Hongsheng laughingly scolded. Fan Xian shook his head and didn't say anything more. He opened his mouth and said, "When I first saw you at Yishur Tavern, you had an assistant at your side. You were free and at ease. I didn't expect you to become like this now. There's nothing bad about this appearance." Li Hongsheng thought of the things that had happened around him these 5 or 6 years and felt slightly moved. That day at Yishur Tavern, there was also Guo Baoquan, his own way, and their group. If Li Hongsheng hadn't brought it up, Fan Xian might have already forgotten who Guo Baoquan was. "You punched Guo Baoquan and later broke up his family." Li Hongsheng looked at Fan Xian and said with a not-quite-there smile. Li Hongsheng looked at Fan Xian and said with a not-quite-there smile. His own way has now become a very popular person in court and the emperor's favorite official. The affairs of the world are all like this. For me to be able to stay out of it, relatively speaking, is not bad. Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. "You're ruthless enough. Before you entered the capital, Jingdo had been peaceful for a dozen years," Li Hongsheng continued. "Ever since you entered the capital, people began to die one after another. Presumably, you also did not expect that bastard, his own way, to be able to climb to his current position. The Imperial Censorate has your Overwatch Council by the neck in the capital. He has begun to enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs to discuss matters and has already begun to threaten you." It had to be said that Li Hongsheng and Fan Xian's attitude towards Sir, he was strangely the same. Solemn. This was because they both held grudges and remembered his own way's desire to eat Fan Ruo, the snow swan. Fan Xian smiled slightly mockingly and said, "The higher his own way climbs, the faster he will fall in the future. I'm not worried about anything." "Of course, you're not afraid of him." Li Hongsheng smiled. "Although I haven't returned to the capital, I've heard of the nickname Servant of 3 Surnames. You must have come up with it." Fan Xian chuckled, tacitly agreeing to it. Li Hongsheng pointed at his nose and sighed. "You still use the same tricks. First, you ruin someone's reputation. Then, using the Emperor's favor, you begin to play unreasonable and sinister tricks. However, let me remind you that his own way is not like me or the second prince. He is an official the Emperor has raised. You cannot touch him lightly." This was indeed a trick that Fan Xian often used. Back then, he had used this trick to push the matter of killing prostitutes and ruining their reputations onto the shoulders of the second prince and Li Hongsheng. In the end, he had forced the second prince to make a dangerous move. Then, Li Hongsheng had been imprisoned in his manor by King Jing for half a year. Correct. There are many officials in the court who are beginning to cling to his own way's leg. Servant of 3 surnames? Actually, the master he has always followed has always been surnamed Li. Furthermore, officials are not afraid of things like reputation, Fan Xian said mockingly. However, these officials probably did not think that no matter how the situation in the court develops, his own way will find it difficult to escape death. "What do you mean?" Fan Xian didn't hide anything in front of Li Hongsheng. He smiled coldly and said, "The Emperor used the Imperial Censorate to check and balance the Overwatch Council and reduce its power. This was something he told me beforehand. I agree with this rule. The Overwatch Council's dominance is not a good thing for the court or the people. But the Overwatch Council's vicious reputation is here. The Emperor had to choose an official who dared to oppose me. Thus, he chose his own way because he knew that no matter how things developed in the future, I would not let him go." A cold taste rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Thus, he could only work hard to climb up. However, no matter how powerful he was and how he developed the Imperial Censorate to the point where it could oppose the Overwatch Council, so what? It was the Yamen of the Imperial Censorate that rose up, not him. On the day that the Overwatch Council truly becomes the Censorate, his own way will no longer have any value. Fan Xian shook his head. The Emperor only has so many sons. Only the third prince can inherit the throne. Regardless of what the third prince thinks in the future, he will have to consider my attitude before he inherits. His own way has suppressed me for so long. What if he doesn't pay a price? He is grass without roots. He is only grasped in the Emperor's hands. Thus, his life depends on how many years the emperor can live. Hearing this, Li Hongchang felt a chill in his heart. Fan Xian closed his eyes and said, "Everyone thinks the emperor is healthy and a great grandmaster. No one has thought that the emperor is now a man in his 50s or 60s. Li Hongchang shook his head. "I have to admit, I don't see things as far as you do. Naturally, otherwise, you wouldn't have been locked up in the manor by King Jing for so long." Fan Xian smiled slightly at him. "Now that I think about it, you saved my life," Li Hongchang said with his head lowered. "If I had stayed in Jingdo 2 years ago, I'm afraid I would already be dead." He raised his head and sighed deeply, just like the second prince. At the mention of the dead, the atmosphere became oppressive again. After a long time, Li Hongchang forced a smile and said, "Of course, this matter cannot be blamed on you. The words you said to the second prince in the tea shop outside Baiwa brothel that day, he later told me. I know you just wanted to bring the second prince down and save his life. However, he is actually as stubborn as you. He doesn't listen to what others say." From the beginning, Li Hongchang had stood behind the second prince in the battle for the throne. After Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, his powerful attacks had only beaten Li Hongchang out of the poisonous waters of Jingdo. He had not beaten the second prince out. Fan Xian knew that the reason Hongchang supported the second prince was not just because of future benefits. Rather, it was because they were good friends to begin with. "I am very sorry for their departure," Fan Xian said. "But there are too many things in this world that we cannot completely solve. I've always been curious." Li Hongchang stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Regardless of whether it is the second prince or the crown prince, they are both working hard to carry out certain things. It seems that only you, from the beginning, determined that the torment of these princes would end in a painful failure. How did you determine this? Did you, from the beginning, calculate that they had no chance of success? "This has to do with my education from a young age," Fan Xian replied seriously. "When I was young, grandmother would hold me and endlessly tell me that the emperor was like this, the emperor was like that, the emperor was undefeatable, and the emperor was like this. I got used to it, so I accepted it." Furthermore, he shook his head. In the end, reality proved that the emperor was indeed undefeatable. Li Hongchang was silent and speechless. He could only shake his head. "You should go back to Jingdo. I know you're afraid of being reminded of the past, but it's good to see the second prince. He, Chengxian, the empress, and the eldest princess are all buried on a beautiful hill. The scenery is not bad." Fan Xian sincerely persuaded this prodigal son who had left home and refused to return. Besides, the prince's health is getting worse and worse. As his son, you have to go back and see. Li Hongchang did not agree. He only sincerely said, "Father was seriously ill last year. It was all thanks to you taking care of him." Rojia's letter said thank you. "There is no need for thanks between us." Fan Xian looked at him and casually said, "At the end of the year, Ro will be returning to the capital." Li Hongchang abruptly raised his head. His eyes lit up. "Yiling, came to Dingzhou to relax. How come I don't see her?" Fan Xian did not continue the previous question. Instead, he asked about another person he cared about a lot. After the second prince died, Wen'er had accompanied Yiling for a while. In the end, it was not very effective. Later, it was Yizhong who asked for an edict to have his daughter sent back to Dingzhou, where she had grown up. Li Hongchang was in Dingzhou. His friendship with the second prince was not shallow. It was indeed appropriate for him to take care of Yiling. Li Hongchang laughed bitterly and said, "After this Wang Fei saw the grasslands, her mood improved greatly. However, she is not someone who can stay idle. At this time, she is in Qingzhou." "Qingzhou." Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and said with blame, "That is the farthest city. It could start a war with Shi Hu at any moment. What can I do?" Li Hongchang glared at him. "There are countless old Yi family generals in the western camp. Those generals look at Yiling like she is a little ancestor. They don't even dare to make a sound. If she wants to go to the frontier to fight, kill, and heal, how can I stop her?" Fan Xian repeatedly shook his head and scolded. What nonsense! Immediately after, he suddenly thought of something and said, Fortunately, I'm about to go to Qingzhou. When I come back, I'll kidnap her and bring her back. After these words were said, it was Li Hongqing's turn to suck in a cold breath. He cursed angrily. You going to Qingzhou? Do you want something to happen and then the emperor to slaughter the entire Dingzhou army to accompany you in death? The cover has changed. Everyone, please look. This is the final Qing Yu Year cover. Thank you for bringing out the crazy knife again. Also, I'm about to add the introduction. Yes, it's the last volume. I've done everything that needs to be done. Friends with monthly votes, please help vote. This month, I still need everyone's support. If I don't ask, there won't be any votes. Objective reality, please help me. P.S. I recommend a book, Food and Lust in the Tang Dynasty. The introduction is as follows. A few voluptuous girls, because they were drunk, transmigrated to the Tang Dynasty. They don't understand ancient Chinese and can't read ancient characters. With great difficulty, they start a business and settle down peacefully. Then, they run into Li Er wanting to cause trouble at Xuanwu Gate. Seeing that their dream of food and lust had become a bubble, survival or destruction was the question they needed to consider. Book number 1049646 that you're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.